The change that takes your life from ambition to meaning. Wayne Dyer. He was an American psychologist and writer of books on spiritual growth. The change that takes your life from ambition to meaning. There is a land of the living and a land of the dead, and the bridge is love, the only survival, the only meaning. From the San Luis Rey Bridge, by Thornton Wilder. I recently had the pleasure of watching an inspiring documentary entitled Hasten Slowly, The Journey of Sir Lawrence Vander Post. Sir Lawrence spent a lot of time with the Kalahari Bushmen, compiling their stories. For me, his extraordinary insights sum up in a few brief paragraphs the essential desire that almost all human beings harbor. Sir Lawrence Vander Post from Hasten Slowly, a Mickey Mull film, as so eloquently recounted, the great hunger, the greatest hunger of all is the hunger for meaning. The shift is an invitation, in both this book and the film of the same name, to explore the process of drifting away from a life aimlessly towards one full of meaning and purpose. I have been committed for many years to helping people, including myself, reach their full potential. I have now made almost 70 trips around our sun, and the only thing that stands out very clearly is that we all want our lives to have purpose and meaning. In this book, I clarify what appears to be necessary to achieve a conscious, enlightened state of awareness that nurtures a life of purpose and meaning. When the movie this book was derived from was first released, it was titled Ambition to Meaning, yet many people were unclear about what those words meant or what the movie was about. It seems that the title was a bit misleading, perhaps indicating that I had made a documentary or that I simply captured one of my lectures on cinema. During the inaugural national tour, when the film was presented to a select audience, I expressed my opinion on the confusion of the title to the director and executive producer. I said, "I love this movie, however, if I were repeating it, I would give it a different title. I would call it The Shift, because this term is mentioned throughout the movie and is what has to take place for a person to go past the ambition to meaning." To my delight and to the credit of the director and producer, within a week the film had a new title. Still, this notion of from ambition to meaning would not go away. As I contemplated how to present this essential message in a companion book to the film, deep meditation led me to use these 4 words as the organizing format for the book. This is precisely what you now have in your hands, or have in your book reader. All of us on this glorious human journey into adulthood have to make some changes or transitions during the journey. Hopefully we go beyond the first 2 required and move on to those shifts in consciousness that lead to a life full of purpose. Now, what do I mean by this? The first change we all make takes us from not being to being, from spirit to form, from the invisible to our corporeal world of things, borders, and stuff. Therefore, the first chapter of this book is titled From. In my humble, and, I'm sure, imperfect, way, I try to define the indefinable using words and phrases that are mere symbols of what defies description. Yet it is what I have come to see as that world of the invisible spirit, from which all things originate and to which all return, looks like. The next change I describe is the change from to ambition, hence Ambition is the title of chapter 2. Ambition is the phase in which we assume a selfish self that is the opposite of the place of the spirit from which we came. The ego in this context is our false self. These are 2 important and mandatory changes that we undertake on this journey of our humanity. Many of us come to the end of our life's journey having made just those 2 transitions. Ambition, sadly, is often the end of life's story. In my movie and in this book, I propose that there are 2 additional shifts available to all of us. When we proceed with them, the life without meaning that Sir Lawrence referred to is not the end of the story. We can all choose to make the leap beyond the second shift of ego-driven ambition. The 3rd chapter is titled To, which means reaching a place in our minds where we realize that we have the option of making a U-turn to get away from the false self and begin to return in the direction of our origin. Or what I call our fromness. This new phase of our life journey is a return to spirit and an invitation to the invisible divine realm to replace the ego's dominance. We learn to tame the ego as we move toward a life of meaning and purpose, fueled by our source of being. The change described in Chapter 4 is meaning. As we leave that false self and begin our journey back to Source while still alive, we live by a new set of guidelines. We find that the laws of the material world do not necessarily apply in the presence of the meaning that is encouraged by our shift to Source. The manifestation of miracles and the newly discovered synchronicity begin to populate the landscape of life. In fact, meaning is what now defines all moments of our existence. In my experience, unfortunately, the ego's ambition is the ultimate purpose of so many lives. However, there are signs that we can notice that signal those two additional changes that free us from our illusion of ego comforts. We can turn around and return to the place of the spirit in a third turn. And then on the fourth turn, we achieve a life of meaning and purpose as we rededicate our ambition to the realization of our authentic selves. We can fulfill our greatest calling when we consciously undertake the journey from ambition to meaning. We can transform our individual lives and, as a bonus, also influence the fate of our sacred planet. Sending love your way, Dr. Wayne W. Dyer, Maui, Hawaii. And your body is the harp of your soul, and it is yours to produce sweet music or confusing sounds. Khalil Gibran. For as long as I can remember, I have had a contemplative nature. When he was little, he brooded about life with questions that rarely had concrete answers. My first attempt to understand death was when Mr. Scarf, half of the couple who ran the foster home where my brother David and I lived, passed away. After Mrs. Scarf told David and me that her husband had died, she handed us both a banana as a kind of distraction from her grief. I immediately asked, "When will he return?" His one-word answer puzzled me. "Never," she replied, wiping the tears from what I perceived to be her ancient face. I immediately went to my place on top of our bunks, peeled my banana, and tried to understand what it never meant. I envisioned beginnings and endings, things like the end of the day and night and then the beginning, and I thought of Mr. Scarf going to work and then coming home. In a rudimentary way, I recognized cause and effect, thinking that the flowers of fruit trees would turn into apples or cherries. But I was frustrated by how Mr. Scarf could never return. That totally disrupted what I knew at that age to be the natural flow of things. I lay down on my top bunk staring at the ceiling, struggling to understand how Mr. Scarf could disappear forever. Every time I thought of her never coming back, I had a sick feeling in my stomach. Then my thoughts would change to something more pleasant, something that I could capture, like, "When will we have dinner? Oh, where is my car?" But my naturally inquisitive mind kept pondering the mysterious and inexplicable idea of eternity, and a dreadful fluttering sensation returned in my stomach, which I feel even now as I write these words. Since Mr. Scarf died, I have written 34 books and given thousands of lectures on the essence of living a spiritual life, and I still feel dizzy when I remember those vivid childhood moments when I was trying to capture the meaning of life, without a body to encapsulate it. As I have continued my writing and speaking activities over the years, I have remained intrigued by what I call the big questions. I have studied spiritual and philosophical teachers from the East and the West, in ancient and modern times, who have explored, and in many cases, lived, the truths that we consider our spiritual heritage. I love contemplating these questions that have puzzled humanity since history has been recorded, and, in all likelihood, even earlier. The mystery of life is still fascinating and exciting to me. I enjoy entertaining the unanswerable, but I also feel at peace with this riddle. One of those big questions is, who am I? Part of the answer is that I am a body with measurable characteristics. Yes, I have a name, talents, and accomplishments, but who I am also includes an intangible presence that I know is part of me. That aspect of myself has no perceptible limits and no visible form. A name for this non-physical aspect is mind, with its endless variety of invisible thoughts that seep into the physical body. My personal answer to the question who am I? The question is that I am a piece of the all-creating source known by many names, including God, Spirit, Source, Tao, Divine Mind, etc. Although I cannot see or touch it, I know that I am part of it, because I must be like where I come from, and what I come from is the formless nothingness that merged into form. Therefore, I am both that invisible spirit who is the source of everything and, at the same time, the form that is destined to return to the invisible. Some other important questions that I have also struggled with are, what happens after the death of my form? What is the purpose of my life? What does forever look like? Who or what is God? I do not claim to have definitive answers to these concerns. If great minds like Lao Tzu, Socrates, Buddha, Rousseau, Descartes, Einstein, Spinoza, Saint Francis, Rumi, Patanjali, Goethe, Shaw, Whitman or Tennyson, among many others, could not come up with the definitive answer, then certainly not I will be able to clarify all these mysteries in a book or even in a lifetime. I can only offer my own interpretation of what I have come to know through study, life, and my concentrated efforts to make conscious contact with my source of being and with what I consider to be the source of everything in this material universe. By far the only question that has puzzled me for as long as I can remember, the one that transcends the question who am I? What is my purpose? What happens after death? Who or what is God? Questions is the title of this first chapter. From where I come from, for me, this has always been the big question. Where do I come from? When I think about the events that occurred and the people who existed before my arrival on planet Earth in 1940, I am intrigued by what caused me to appear at the precise moment that I did. Where was I before I was conceived in 1939? What was he doing during the 12th and 13th centuries while the Crusades were taking place? Where was I in 2500 BC? See, when were the pyramids being built? What or where was I millions of years ago before human beings began to appear on this planet, while dinosaurs roamed the earth? Contemplating questions of this nature led me to study a good deal of the science that explains how things are formed. While I am by no means an expert in this area, here is what I have learned. My understanding is that quantum physics considers this fact scientifically unassailable, that at the smallest subatomic level, the particles themselves do not originate from a particle. This means that matter originates from something that has no form. Scientists call the lack of form that matter produces energy. This immaterial energy produced the particle that became who I am today. I think of this as a shift from energy to form, and as you read this book, I invite you to consider the changes you have made to be who and where you are now. I think of the tiny speck of human protoplasm that was my first particle of humanity as part of a kind of future jerk that morphed into a fetus, and then a baby, a toddler, a teenager, a young man, a mature adult, a middle-aged man, and a person who has lived for almost 70 years. All these changes were inherent in that original energy that materialized as a microscopic particle and became me. It is beyond my ability to understand how such a miraculous development could take place in the formation of who I am as a physical being. But I do think it happened regardless of my ability to do a lot about it, besides just observing my development. I am really and truly doing absolutely nothing. It seems more true simply to observe myself being lived by this creative energy that seems to do nothing and, at the same time, leaves nothing undone. So where did that tiny microscopic dot that was my first experience as a particle come from? Remember that quantum physics emphatically tells us that particles do not come from particles. If we reduce that original particle to its subatomic state, it is smaller than the chromosomes, atoms, electrons within the atom, and even subatomic particles called quarks. Scientists have placed a quark the size of my point of origin in a particle accelerator accelerated to 250,000 miles per hour and collided with another quark. The result? There was nothing there. It seems that nothing exists at the moment of transition to something. Or, as I like to say, from nowhere so far here. Everything that exists in the world of from is pure energy without form, without particles. Modern physics confirms the metaphysics of Genesis, which tells us that everything came from God and everything was fine. Similarly, the Tao Te Ching tells us that all being originates from non-being. Therefore, the question of where we come from is similarly answered by physics and metaphysics. Both conclude that we originate from something that has no form, borders, principle, or substance. We are all essentially spiritual beings who have a temporary human experience. This is our essence. This is where we come from. We are what we come from. In the movie version of The Shift, I have a brief discussion with several of the characters about this key concept: everything in the material world must be like where it came from, including each and every one of us. In the movie I refer to a piece of apple pie on a plate and ask, what is that piece of pie like? The obvious answer is that it's like apple pie because it must be like where it came from. This is a familiar concept when we think about drawing blood for a diagnostic test. A small syringe of blood provides doctors with information about the entire supply of the person from whom it was drawn. Why? Because the sample must be like where it came from. I extend this logic to me and to you as well. Since I do not come from my parents, it is not a logical conclusion to say that I must be like them. Since I do not come from my culture, my religion, or anything in this world, it is not necessarily so that it should be the same as my environment or my society. But since I come from an invisible source of energy that some call God, or Tao, or Divine Mind, then I must be like where I come from. My conclusion about my origin is that I come from the Spirit, and my true essence is that I am what I come from. I am a divine piece of God. I am first and always a spiritual being indissolubly connected to my source of being. Robert Burns summarized this poetically in his poem New Year's Day, written in 1791. What has no form cannot be destroyed. The formless aspect of all beings exists in eternity, impervious to beginnings or endings. The truth seems to be that our essence is eternal, and it is only the physical body that seems to come and go in a cycle of birth and death. What we call birth and death are actually as inseparable as the two sides of a coin, or day and night. The question, where do I come from? In reality it only addresses the self, which is the physical body. But that physical aspect originated in non-being. We are exactly like the great Tao or God, and we have the freedom to make decisions. Some of our options cause our source link to become contaminated and rusted. One of those mediocre options is to believe that the expression of God through our physical being is an end point, or the latter, rather than an opportunity to choose how to express this gift. In this way, we bring out God and create an ego-driven life. The great lesson on this philosophical journey is to recognize our primary identity as a spiritual being that is eternal and therefore impervious to both birth and death. Our physical self is an expression in the form of energy of our spiritual essence. Our real self is the loving observer of our sensory experiences. To fully harmonize with that essential nature, we must dedicate ourselves to expressing its energy and being fully aware of the sacred choice we are making. For some, that will mean becoming more like God while temporarily housed in your body. For others, it will create divine expressions of beauty, purpose, and wisdom in form. The human journey in bodily form is just a parenthesis in the eternity of our real self. When the parenthesis closes, we are completely immersed in spirit without the materialized self. We are on that round trip that Lao Tzu refers to in his famous line from verse 40 of the Tao Te Ching, returning is the movement of the Tao. In the film version of The Shift, I quote from T.S. Eliot's poem Little Gidding. But before we get rid of our physical body and complete this return journey, we can begin to understand our original nature by making an effort to be more like what we imagine our source of being to be. One way to conceptualize this is to imagine yourself looking through a viewfinder that provides a clear image of the creative source. Through these lenses, we see how you think, feel, and behave. This view of our source gives us a clearer view of our true selves. Understand the answer to where did I come from? It involves, more than anything else, trying to live from a perspective that is in harmony with our original nature. We must become more like the spiritual nature of our origin. By recognizing the expression of divine consciousness that is our physical being, we in turn make the decision of how to express that divine spirit. How the spirit seems to be. Very often our physical world does not seem to be very spiritual, despite having originated from the spiritual essence. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow expressed this dilemma in his poem A Psalm of Life. The poet speaks of your life and mine as something beyond the physical, which he describes as dust. We are all something different than what we identify with our senses. There is no grave for our essential essence, our spirit, but we can ignore it and lose contact with it. In fact, that's a fairly common situation for all of us during different periods of our lives when we choose to put our physical selves in charge. I love how another of my favorite poets, Rabindranath Tagore, was able to describe in 2 short lines what he thought was our most important spiritual lesson. God loves to see in me, not his servant, but himself, who serves everyone. The important questions we should ask ourselves are, am I like God now? Am I getting closer? I'm here? If our true essence is the spirit, and we believe that this is where we come from, it seems like a simple task to reconnect with this authentic part of ourselves. One way to do this is to change our thoughts and actions to the way we imagine creative energy thinks and acts when its energy materializes into form. We need to be more like the spirit seems to be. Since this is what we came from, our divinity is our destiny, regardless of how we have neglected it over the years. God, or the great Tao, of which we are all a part, just wait patiently for us to be the way it is. I imagine the all-creating spirit, if it really wants something for us, would want us to realize that. An inspiring example of this is found in The Quiet Mind, Sayings of White Eagle. His personal contribution to the great plan for the evolution of man is to continually insist on the love of God, always look towards the light, and thus train yourself to recognize the goodness of God working through everyone else. I don't think God cares whether or not we show our love by building magnificent buildings for worship, attending services, or practicing the rules set by religious organizations. It seems to me that if God were to speak to us, the message would simply be to love one another and offer reverence rather than enmity towards all of life. The journey that we have undertaken that has brought us to this moment in this body encompasses something that I am calling from. We come from something, from somewhere, some way, and it is a mystery to our little human minds, which tend to think in ways of cause and effect. My conclusion is that if we are here now, there must have been a before, and there certainly will be an after. However, I acknowledge the possibility that there is no before, no after, and no timeline. In fact, everything can be complete and everything happening at the same time, without time, without space, without before or after. But I can't write from that perspective because my little human mind wants everything to be logical and understandable. Therefore, I will describe how the spirit appears to be 2 different journeys. The first is the journey of formless pure spirit to form, and the second is the journey from a subatomic particle to birth. 1. From pure formless spirit to form, from non-being to being. Writing about non-being as the place from which we originate requires that I speculate imaginatively on what the spiritual world of non-being is. The way I do this is to imagine a divine consciousness that is in the business of manifesting the form of nothingness. Imagining a creation without a creator is a lot like trying to imagine a watch without a watchmaker. Observing the creation every day, I cannot help but contemplate that the flowers emerge from the seeds, the fruits emerge from the flowers, and the giant oaks emerge from the small acorns. Despite my amazement and lack of pure understanding, my curiosity about the world of pure spirit continually plays with the assumption of questions about the before and after, or from where and to where. Non-being is a deliriously paradoxical state of contemplation, because I know in my heart that it certainly exists, but I only have my beingness with which to contemplate. I have already described my self-limitations regarding the understanding of my existence. With that in mind, I offer you how I perceive the appearance of fromness. I conclude that everything is energy, everything is vibration at a variety of frequencies. The faster the vibration, the closer one will be to spirit and understanding where we come from. The pen that I hold in my hand as I write these words appears to be solid, yet a glance at it through a powerful microscope shows that it is actually a field of moving particles, with a mostly empty space between those particles. The vibratory composition of my pen is energy that is slow enough to appear solid to my eyes, which can only perceive objects that fit within a certain frequency. I listen to the sounds of mynah birds as I write, and I know from my limited exposure to the laws of physics that sounds are faster energy than my solid pen. The light that I see flowing into my window is an even faster energy, with tiny particles moving so fast that they appear to be green, blue, or yellow, depending on how the rods and cones in my eyes are calibrated to pick up these energetic signals. Beyond the frequencies of light are the vibrational energies of thought. Yes, thought is an energy system. The most calibrated frequencies of thought, measured through simple kinesiology methods, reveal that the fastest vibrations approach the ultimate in energy vibration, the dimension of spirit itself. The highest vibratory thoughts are aligned with the energy source of the Tao or God. When experienced as thoughts, these faster vibrations create strength, but slower thoughts create a weaker response on kinesiology tests. The way this works is when we focus mental energy on source-aligned thought and raise an arm to shoulder height as a test of our strength, it is difficult for anyone to lower it. When we focus our mental energy on slower frequency thoughts, however, our raised arm is easily pushed down by another person. When it comes to kinesiology, every negative emotion weakens the physical body. These studies are graphic examples of the world of non-being and are also opportunities to explore the frequencies that harmonize with the vibrations of source energy. That field from which all things originate and to which all things return has a meaning. Based on the research and musings of some of the most revered beings to ever walk this earth, creation itself is not an act of violence, it is a pleasant and joyous act. There does not appear to be any fear, shame, guilt, anger, humiliation, anxiety, or hatred associated with the functioning of the great Tao that seems to do nothing and yet leave nothing undone. Remember that the body we live in 24 hours a day, 7 days a week was not created by a human being, it is a creation of God. So it makes perfect sense to me that if our body, God's creation, is full of negative thoughts, it would be weak. Simply expressing a falsehood weakens a strong person's arm, expressing the truth always creates a strong physical response because the truth is from God. How could the creation or the Creator create from a false perspective? There is an abundance of literature based on rigorous research in kinesiology that not being, where we come from, is aligned with the energy that is strongest in expressing the truth. The highest/fastest vibrating thought that will always keep us strong is the energy of love. My conclusion is that not being and love are synonymous. Mysticism and practically all religions affirm that the Supreme Being is love and that the only pure truth is love. Some religions trivialize the Supreme Being by inventing a God in the image and likeness of humans. His is a deity of endless and fussy rules who is easily offended, always against sin, and prone to anger, revenge and punishment. The love of which I speak personifies not being, accessed and incorporated within us from where we originate. It has no rules, it does not want to control, it never punishes and it does not know how to descend into anti-love expressions. The entire universe, as I see it, is made of love, and each one of us seems to be an individualized expression of the one being of love. Simplified, God is love. I like Ralph Waldo Emerson's description of love as synonymous with God. What an incredibly magnificent concept, this idea of non-being that exists as a state of pure and indescribable bliss, and that is necessary for the act of creation to take place. Think about it, we come from love, therefore, we must be love in some way, since we must be like where we come from. Jesus put it this way, he who does not love does not know God, because God is love, 1 John 4:8. Pretty basic and very straightforward. Not being is love. As we come from not being, we must be love. But somehow we manage to get away from our original nature. Every thought of not love is a movement away from where we came from. Every act of judgment, anger, shame, fear, anxiety, and violence is a movement toward not loving and not knowing God. Even a thought contrary to love is a movement away from our original nature. What was it like to be in that state of pure love waiting for our transition to beingness? What we were doing? Once we take shape, these questions are almost impossible to contemplate. However, here is my conceptualization of what it feels like to not be before traveling into this world of shapes and limits. Any. The only thing we can certainly agree on is that we had nothing. There was nothing to possess, nothing to do, nothing to fight against, nothing to worry about. We were nothing in physical terms. This idea of nothing is really difficult for us. We have entered a world where something has not replaced anything, where form replaced non-form. In our material world, owning nothing and doing nothing are generally interpreted as signs of failure. However, our true essence is more comfortable with nothing. It seems to me that the most effective way to know and experience where we come from is to do everything possible to reconnect with nothingness by creating the experience of the absence of attachments, things, and thoughts. We do this simply by being, rather than doing and hoarding. As Herman Melville is believed to have said, God's only voice is silence, and this is an invitation to experience our original world of nothing. All creation emerges from the silent void, as do all sounds. Every bit of light comes from nowhere, all thought arises from no thought. There is a Zen proverb that reminds us that it is the silence between the notes that makes music. Without silence to interrupt sounds, there can be no music. It would be just one long continuous tone. But of course, even the long tone originated from a vacuum. The nothing is mathematically equivalent to the expression of zero, it cannot be divided, it has no empirical value, and if we multiply something by it, we get a sum of nothing. However, without the indivisible zero, the math itself would be impossible. Before coming to this material world, our essence was nothing. We had no things to get in the way, there were no rules, no duties, no money, no parents, no hunger, no fear, nothing at all. When I wrote essays on the 81 verses of the Tao Te Ching for my book Change Your Thoughts, Change Your Life, I was amazed at how much emphasis Lao Tzu put on knowing the great Tao, God, by giving up everything, letting it go. From all attachments, do less, possess nothing, and practice coming to know God by emptying rather than filling the mind. Almost all the great spiritual teachers tell us to meet God in the void and to listen to God speak to us in silence. So one of the answers to the question where do we come from is, nowhere, with nothing. We must make the effort to find our way to that peaceful nothingness while we are still in our body. We can empty our pockets or purse, but we especially need to empty our minds and enjoy the joy of living in our physical world while simultaneously experiencing the bliss of nothingness. This is our origin, as well as surely our final destination. Albert Einstein once pointed out that everything is void and that form is a condensed void. And according to my teacher Nisargadatta Maharaj, this is true liberation, knowing that you are nothing. All your knowledge, including yourself, is liquidated, so you are. 6. Unity. Closely aligned with nothingness is the idea of unity. How can it be that at our spiritual core, we are both nothing, apart from being connected to something called unity? Everything in this physical universe of ours is somehow connected to everything else, because everything originated in the void of nothing. There are not several of these gaps to choose from. We come from the same void that everyone and everything else came from. When we try to isolate something, we find that it is somehow part of everything else in the universe. Just as it is absurd for a single wave to see itself as separate from the ocean, for any of us it is not recognizing our unity with what we know as infinity. Unity is difficult to understand properly because we are so immersed in a world of things that seem different to us. The first line of the Tao Te Ching suggests that the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. In other words, as soon as it is named, it is lost, because we have created a dichotomy. Unity means exactly that, just one. Like I said before, like zero in math, it cannot be divided or subdivided. The moment we label or name it, it is something else, separate, Consequently, it is not the unity of unity. Lao Tzu repeatedly mentions that when we named him, we lost him. In the unit, there are no names, there is only one. That is why it is so impossible to write about unity. Every word I use to describe it illustrates that I am not understanding it. Where we come from is devoid of dichotomies, unlike our material world, which depends on pairs of opposites. In this world, without a concept of above, there can be no below. Without an idea of death, there is no life. The North Pole of a magnet cannot exist without the South Pole. No man, no woman. Not right, not wrong. We think in dichotomies and we identify ourselves from opposites. We know what we like, what tastes good, what feels good, etc., because of our experience with what we don't like. Because of this material world, many of us find it difficult to access unity, the world that the ancient master Hermes described in this way. God is one. And he who is one has no name, because he does not need a name, since he is alone. All things have been derived from one. The idea of unity is almost impossible to understand because we live in a world of contrasts, and contrast requires more than one element. So here we are, persistently in our two-person world. How can we grasp the idea of unity in the world of non-being that we occupy before reaching beingness? One way might be to think of our fingers, legs, arms, toes, and eyes. We don't think of them as separate entities from our total being. We do not refer to our fingers as separate from ourselves. Although they have their unique qualities and character, they are part of the unit that we refer to as ourselves. The same happens with our relationship with the Source or God before coming to this world. In that world, which I call our deity, we and God were one. Unity as a concept of where we come from means discarding all ideas of separation from anything and anyone. We can simulate unity through the part of ourselves that knows silence where there are no names or things. Here, we can begin to feel our connection to everyone, to the earth, to the universe, and ultimately to the great Tao. Unity becomes accessible in that great power, which acts without doing, keeps the whole universe in order and generates form out of nothing. If we imagine that we are free from all labels, all separations, and all judgments about this world and the life that inhabits it, we can begin to understand unity. The place we want to enter is simply being. We can imagine the source of being as an energy that is as available to us as the sky. There is no anger towards anything or anyone because everyone and everything is spirit. This spirit is God, our source of being. We are, and it is what we are. We relax in the silence where we come from. We discover the meaning of life by being able to return to unity and nothingness while still in material form, without having to leave our body in the ritual of death. The closer we get to experiencing our original nature, the more peace and purpose flow through us. 2. From a subatomic particle to birth, earliest being at birth, we have examined the logic and spiritual speculation of how our non-self might be. Please remember that this is largely my interpretation of the invisible world of spirit, which is both our source of origin and our place of return when our physical selves are no longer animated by divine consciousness. In a magically mysterious nanosecond, we made the transition from not being to being. A subatomic particle of human protoplasm emerged from spirit and took care of everything that was needed for the journey we call life. An invisible force that I call a future pole was set in motion, filling our physical characteristics. Our maximum height, body shape, eye, skin, and hair color, wrinkles that would one day appear, and, of course, the matter of our body ceasing to be alive, it was all fixed, without us having to do anything about it. In the movie The Shift, I speculate that if everything necessary for the physical journey is handled by the nameless nothingness, then it is not beyond my ability to hypothesize that everything necessary to fulfill our entire destiny also arose in that moment of transition from not being to beingness. Our dharma, our essential purpose for being here, our personality, and all the help we would need along the way were also at that microscopic point. If our body was on a journey that is handled by the great Tao or God, then I say, why not everything else about us as well? The main feature of this 9-month journey is what I call delivery. We had nothing to do. Somehow, our source of being in its infinite wisdom would do it all. We and our biological mother allowed the great Tao to do what it does. The truth is that we weren't doing anything, we were just finishing up. Throughout that 9-month journey, we were lived by the Tao. Understanding where we came from and where we will return is truly experiencing the feeling of total surrender. This means allowing the force that is doing everything to do it simply without interference. In those first 9 months of our life as a microscopic point, and then as a growing embryo, we and our mother practice non-interference. Our natural wisdom knew that all we needed to thrive and flourish was to be cared for by the invisible force that seemed to do nothing and yet left nothing undone. We didn't have to worry about when our nails would appear and whether they would grow on the fingertips instead of behind the ears. Our heartbeat started just in time, with no need to make arrangements to turn it on. By surrendering and allowing ourselves, we were being formed into the perfection to which we signed up while we were installed in non-being. The energy responsible for our beingness knew exactly what to do and when to do it. This is our authentic self. From the moment of conception, we were enveloped in the arms of infinite invisible wisdom. We allowed our true selves to develop into the perfect blueprint that was inherent in both our non-being and our beingness. If we had been completely immersed in that state of consciousness, we would have stayed aligned with our source. In that scenario, there is no reason to wonder about the purpose of our life. That little speck that we were knew nothing about accumulating, achieving, or having ambition. It was just being, allowing yourself to surrender to the invisible force that manages everything. But instead of staying in that state of allowing and surrendering, we were hooked on a set of beliefs that put ambition before concession. The part of us that comes from allowing, surrendering, and being, came in shape to a place where ambition was given paramount importance. If we had been able to continue our lives with what we came from, we would be living at the highest levels of God realization or consciousness. The lighting would be ours, and it seems that it was intended that way. As Jesus said, even the smallest of you can do all that I have done and even greater things, and isn't it written in your law, I said, you are God's. John 10:34. In fact, where we come from is God and therefore we are also God. The reality seems to be that we all tend to shift to ambition in a way that we insist on leading. The possibility is that we all have the option to later switch to the meaning and thus complete our return to the place I am calling from. In the next chapter, I'll talk about the ambition phase. Here is a summary and suggestions to get our fromness back. Any. Allow yourself to enjoy silence and meditation. Even if you don't have a structured meditation practice, take time to just savor the silence. Turn off ratchets at home and in your car. Create time to be in nature away from human-made sounds. Learn to treat your inward travels as a sacred space, repeatedly spending moments indulging in physical and mental relaxation. Stop worrying, planning, thinking, remembering, wondering, waiting, wishing, or remembering. Consciously release every physical sensation you notice. Do this one moment at a time. Enter a state where you can let your possessions, your family, your home, your job, and your body cease to exist. Experience the inner bliss of nothingness. When you come out of your silence, begin the detachment process by literally giving away something you don't use at least once a day. In nowhere you will find a greater intimacy with your source of being. Unit. Begin to see yourself as connected to each person you meet by valuing and loving the part of you that flows through all of life. Feel your connection to all of nature and practice love and non-judgment, starting with yourself. This means that when you feel offended or upset, instead of directing your attention to the person or incident outside of you, observe what you are feeling and where you feel it in your body. Redirect your attention from external circumstances to an examination of how that particular discomfort feels in your body. This is how you start practicing the unit. Set your inner barometer on love and acceptance of the feelings you are experiencing. Remember that you are one with God and therefore you are love. That is all you have to offer, so start by loving the parts of yourself that are hurt, offended, or upset. As you fully integrate, assembling the parts into the unity that is you, you will discover the impossibility of being separate from anyone else on our planet. Simply recognizing moments of anger or annoyance as opportunities to get to know yourself better and to forgive and love yourself will broaden your awareness of the unity that you are. Practice this kind of unity and love will flow out naturally to include others whom you have previously judged. Give up. Practice the art of allowing. Watch your body as you perform your movements. Hair that turns gray or falls out, skin falls out, the little changes that happen on their own, regardless of your opinion about them. Then practice the same kind of non-interference with your family, your friends, your co-workers, everyone. The Beatles were right, there will be an answer if you just let it be. This is surrender. This is the art of giving up your need to control your world and everyone in it. As we in the recovery movement have been saying for many years, let it go and let God. When you practice delivery on a daily basis, everything seems to fall into place. You came from a place of well-being, love, goodness, gentleness, joy, and purity. This is your fromness. Surrender to Him. When I realize that I want to control my destiny, I say to myself, let it go, Wayne. Let it go and let God. Try this using your own name, it works. My attempts to describe where we come from are stated in verse 21 of the Tao Te Ching. The greatest virtue is following the Tao and only the Tao. I close this chapter on its origin by quoting my favorite passage from A Course in Miracles, pages 486 to 488. It reminds us all that knowing where we come from is a function of remembering, and that we cannot unravel the mysteries of our spiritual origins unless we move to a place where we can, in fact, remember our source of being, right here, right here. Same. Now, study this passage carefully and you will discover the mystery that is your true source of being. Shut up, let the conflict go, put yourself at peace and remember the eternal sweetness that resides within you. All unhappiness is due to the ego. With it comes all your problems. If you denied the ego and burned it by ignoring it, you would be free. Ramana Maharshil. Before the moment of birth, and before our ambition phase begins, each of us is fully aligned with God or the Tao, or whatever name we choose to call the source of our being. In that stage prior to the form of fromness, ambition is not something we entertain, we do not have goals or aspirations. There is nothing we have to do or take care of, no one to impress or defeat, all we have to do is just be. Our existence in the from experience is precisely what our source of being intended, free from interference. We are our authentic selves. At that stage, we are as much like God as most of us have been since. In the film version of The Shift, I describe how we move away from our authentic self, our divinity, and adopt a false one. We come into this world as a perfect creation, but for many reasons, we are encouraged to leave this authentic self behind and assume a false one. We, and those responsible for our upbringing, are often unaware that our destiny and everything we need to fulfill our dharma is embedded in us. With good intentions, we are seduced into becoming a self that is diametrically opposed to who we truly are. The nature of our false self. Imagine a creature advancing on its developmental journey in form here on Earth, learning and believing that it is something different than what it came to be here. Take, for example, a baby hyena who is told by father figures that it is not actually a hyena. This baby hyena is prohibited from following its natural inclinations to frolic, sharpen its teeth, stalk its prey, run with the herd, hunt in groups, make noise, or chew on the carcasses of animals it has killed. Instead, the young hyena's parents have told him to stop all strange behaviors like laughing and howling and to stay put while the other hyenas hunt, in other words, to believe that he is something he is not. The point is that everything that is part of creation has a dharma. No animal, bird, insect, fish or plant can cultivate a false self or believe that it is something other than what the creative source intended. There is still no evidence to doubt what Emerson once noted in his journal, "All a turtle's thoughts are turtles." Emerson was pointing out the same thing that I am here, that all of God's creatures are authentic and can only be what their Dharma intended them to be. Are human beings an exception to God's intention? Some aspects of our development raise that question. We do not continue to develop as creation determined, in the same way that we did in those first 9 months in our mother's womb. After that time of development, we were greeted by parents, a culture, and a host of well-meaning individuals representing religious, educational, and business interests. They hugged us, admired the miracle of creation and looked up to heaven, saying, "Great work, God. Absolutely, incredibly perfect. Thank you, thank you, thank you. But now we will take over from here." Thus began our shift into the strange and twisted world of ambition. We receive metaphorical training wheels and become apprentices in the vigorous effort to convince ourselves that we are not part of divine consciousness. In the shift to become part of the world of ambition, we learn to aspire to something totally alien to our fromness. This path required us to re-identify ourselves in a way that no hyena or turtle would ever have imagined. The shift to ambition requires humans to cultivate an ego, to surpass God. We are trained to believe that who we really are is what our ego convinces us is our true self. We spend more than half of our lives, on average, believing and trusting the training we receive on the importance of having ambition. The next big change is when we realize that a false self only offers empty promises and an author's guarantee, recrimination, and futility, to be discussed in the next 2 chapters. For now, let's see what that false self teaches us as we traverse the ego path and learn to believe in the importance of ambition as a way of defining who we are. Assuming an ego. As we exit the world of spirit at birth, we begin the dangerous journey of acquiring an identity that is virtually the opposite of our true selves. I call this development of the ego or false self the period of ambition. It's a stark contrast to our fromness, where ambition was largely unknown because we simply let ourselves be lived by the great Tao. Thus begins the journey from being nobody and feeling satisfied with our nobody state, to being immersed in a curriculum that my friend Ram Dass calls someone's training. The ego insists that we go from nothing to something, from being nobody to being someone, from unity to duality, from unity to separation. It is this journey that requires us to overcome God and learn to believe in a false self. Ego's number one job at this stage is to eliminate our nobody state by fostering ambition and creating a new, albeit false, identity. The quote that opens this chapter presents the ego as the cause of our problems. If we want to know pure happiness and live a happy life, we must do what Sri Ramana Maharshi says and learn to burn the ego by ignoring it. But the ego is adept at resisting our efforts to ignore it, and it will do everything it can to prevent us from sacrificing our status as someone. The ego wants us to be someone more important than others. I have isolated 6 components of the ego, the false self. They are what our ego tells us to convince us that we are something more than the nobody that we could have remained. Beginning with childhood and throughout our training of someone, we learn to believe in them. Here is a detailed explanation of each of the 6 lies the ego wants us to believe. 1. Who I am is what I have. From the beginning, we received the message that having nothing is equivalent to being a human being with no value as a person. As we grow in this ego identification component, we learn that the more things we accumulate, the more important we are. Our concept of ourselves changes from feeling that we are valuable because we exist as a piece of God to evaluating our worth based on the number of toys we own, their monetary value, and the prestige that other people assume they have. In our culture. In the movie The Shift, a wealthy couple, who own lots of fancy toys and flaunt their cars, clothes, houses, and country club memberships, evaluate their success in life based on their extensive inventory of possessions. However, it is clear that they have an equally disproportionate sense of themselves. The more things they accumulate, the more they have to worry about, resulting in chasing more things, and the merry-go-round goes on and on. This ultimately culminates in a very moving moment in the film where the husband begins to wonder if his entire life has been wrong. It is a compelling question to consider. What if we spent our entire lives chasing symbols of success, collecting more, and always striving for something bigger and better than our neighbors? The mantra of ego is more. It seems to scream at us from the depths, you will be happy once you win something else, something more expensive, something that will give you prestige and power. This hoarding mentality begins with the toys of our childhood. If we don't remember our own childhood, we can see and hear a portrait of how young children today express it: these are my toys. These are mine. When we become adults, our larger, more expensive versions of toys personify our success. When these possessions are lost or threatened, we feel our value as human beings diminishes. The same happens when someone else has more than us, or when we cannot afford to acquire more things. The problem with this mindset of evaluating ourselves on the basis of what we have acquired is this: if we are what we have, when we don't have, we are not. The ego is a tough foreman. As far as she is concerned, our own worth is at stake. Of course we know we came here with nothing, and we won't take anything with us when we leave. However, during our life, the ego manages to imprison us. If we let it, our things govern us and determine our worth. It is not uncommon for people whose identity depends on ego values to fall into depression and even commit suicide when their things are threatened or disappear. One of my favorite lines in the Tao Te Ching reminds us that what we win causes more problems than what we lose, and that by being content we will never be disappointed. This type of thinking does not sit well with the ego, because it is the part of us that believes that our very essence is linked to what we have, and there can be no satisfaction when our things are taken from us. This is why so many people who are striving to achieve more and more feel discontented and distraught and ultimately see themselves as failures when their inventory of things decreases in some way. Where we come from and where we return is a place where our things are unnecessary to feel joy and satisfaction. Everything that was presented to us as a fetus and as a virgin child gave us a great sense of fullness. I used to see my young children express so much joy by playing with a cardboard box or a spool of thread or some napkins. They could get lost just looking at a fluttering butterfly or a tiny ant on the sidewalk. They were filled with awe at practically anything that entered their field of consciousness. This is a remnant of our deity. We were that way too. We must take seriously the advice of the Persian poet Rumi: sell your intelligence and buy bewilderment. Our obsession with owning more and boasting about our possessions is an indication that we have allowed our false selves to become the dominant force in our life. When the false self defines us, it means that we are defined by something that is not true. It is a spiritually ruined way of managing our life. Who we are has nothing to do with things or even our physical selves. We don't need anything to verify or validate us. We are infinite individualized expressions of God's period. Things and so-called ownership do not verify who we are. We are what we have is the false belief of the ego, which is fostered by our culture. 2. Who I am is what I do. Early in life, we learn that what we do and how well we do it can be used to define ourselves favorably. In fact, he grabbed my finger, and he's only 6 hours old. I watch at my eyes, he's so alert. He picked up his toy and held it at 3 months. He took his first step. He said his first words. There are thousands of things like this that have earned us accolades and made us know how special and wonderful we were. All of this is the work of the ego striving to direct us. We learn that doing things, especially if we do them earlier and better than others, is rewarding. We learn to be more of a human being than a human being, which just has to be. A human doing is evaluated on the basis of what it does and how it compares to all other doers. I do not claim that this observation is critical or critical. I just want to point out that having the ambition to be a doer was a top priority in our development years. With each task that we mastered, such as crawling, walking, talking, learning to go to the bathroom, riding a tricycle and then a bicycle, and learning to tie our shoes, we acquired an identity that told us, when you do things, and do them better and before your counterparts, then you have value. We were rewarded for our accomplishments with praise, candy, money, or whatever our particular family used to reward us. Again, I feel the need to point out that none of these performance boosters are bad. It simply teaches the aspiring human to believe in the ego's personalized message of you are what you do, which is blatantly false. You are not what you do. If you never did anything in your entire life, you would still be a spiritual being having a human experience and not the other way around. The ego longs for confirmation of our worth through indicators. The spirit operates on a totally different basis. Home is beyond the ego, as the spiritual entity known as Emmanuel says. Our early teaching convinces us that our accomplishments define who we are. Our educational system emphasizes achievement, reinforcing the idea even more. No gold star is easily interpreted as worthless as a person. When we fail a test, our sense of self is a feeling of failure, and those ego-strengthening notions become our reality. From preschool to graduate school, the messages are similar. It defines how well we do. If we don't get it right, they label us underperforming. The concept of ambition as an indicator of how much value we have, both in the eyes of our fellow men and in the mind of God, is firmly grounded in our conscience. These ideas carry over into all aspects of our developing ego. The popular saying winning is not everything, it's the only thing makes 50% of the competitors losers, since every competition that has a winner must also have a loser. In all areas of life, whatever we do tends to define our worth. The artist whose portfolio is judged inferior to that of another often feels a loss of value as a human being. The singer who does not reach number one in some category feels that he is worth less. Ego training continues into adulthood, often eradicating any concept of self based on our divinity as a piece of God that came from non-action and is headed back to non-action. Ego training contributes to a concept of ourselves that causes us to shrink into a feeling of insignificance in our meager portfolio in contrast to those who have accomplished more. The truth is that we don't have to do anything to validate ourselves as worthy and valuable. If we had done nothing but be divine, we would fulfill our own dharma. Ironically, we most likely would have created a bigger and more impressive resume. At this very moment, I am writing without doing. That's how it is. I just allow ideas to come through me and onto this page. I'm not busy writing, trying, fighting, working, or doing anything else. I'm just letting go and letting God go, just as I do with my heart, my lungs, my circulatory system, and everything else that the physical self understands. I let myself be, not thinking big and setting giant goals, but remembering Lao Tzu's advice in the Tao Te Ching. Yes, this is truly paradoxical, and it points exactly to the way all creation takes place. God does nothing, but leaves nothing undone. If we dissuade the ego by burning it with inattention, we achieve what we came to do and be here, being instead of doing. Our nails grow, our food digests, and our heart beats without us doing anything to make these things happen. In the movie The Shift, David, the frustrated filmmaker, illustrates what I'm writing about. His character represents the problems that arise with his ego's belief, I am what I do. If you can't make your movie, you lose not only your happiness, but your soul as well. Only when David begins to let go, to take a few moments to be present in the present and to let in the ideas taught in the film, does the magic begin to take hold. I repeat what will become a familiar theme: if we are what we do, when we do not or cannot, we are not. I think we should pay special attention to this point. Most people raised in the modern world are skeptical of doing nothing. We are weaned by ambition and, in particular, by his expression of doing more. However, we must consider the very real and troubling aspects of believing that we are what we do. In the movie, David loses his sense of self-worth due to the teachings of the ego. He gets depressed and feels totally lost, all because he's convinced by the ego's teachings that he defines himself as a worthy individual on the basis of what he achieves. For David, then, not having the film project he wants makes him feel that he is not a person of value. It is a false conclusion based on living off the false self. This is the danger of listening to the ego instead of our authentic self. Every time we feel like we've failed, we jeopardize our worth as human beings. If we are ill or injured and can no longer perform to our standards, we also become candidates for depression or are susceptible to a multitude of physical ailments. As we go through the process of watching our bodies age naturally, we will notice a gradual decline in our physical abilities. Members of the generation behind us are likely to even surpass our accomplishments, which is routinely the case in competitive sports like swimming and running. Ultimately, unable to remain the doer we once were, it seems our worth as a human doing has evaporated. That scenario is only true if we listen to a false teacher of our ego. I have reached the age that many refer to as retirement time. But I have practiced ego burning in this regard for several decades. I am not my job. I am not my achievements. I am not my resume. I live, breathe, and work from my authentic self. As I have said here, and in many of my previous writings, I do not write, I am writing and I am the one who writes. I simply follow Lao Tzu's advice to be lived by the great Tao who animates all things without doing anything. This being the case, how is the concept of retirement possible? How can I withdraw from who I am? And who I am allows this writing and speaking and everything else I do to take place. My advice for giving up the ego's assumptions that we are what we do is to live from our most authentic selves. Then when we can, we must replace ambition with meaning. When we make the change to the meaning, we see the absurdity of being able to withdraw from who we are. I have always appreciated Picasso's observation when evaluating ourselves based on what we do. While I work, he said, I leave my body outside the door. As Muslims remove their shoes before entering the mosque. 3. We can treat our work like this, leaving our body outside and letting our soul do it. 3. Who I am is what others think of me. Throughout life, we are bombarded by messages from the ego that try to convince us that our value comes from the observations and opinions of others. Once again, this false self proclaims as true that something or someone external to us is responsible for our validation. And again, it is necessary to remind ourselves who we really are. We are divine pieces of the complete and individualized expressions of God created out of the great void. Our authentic self is the same where it comes from. Our connection to our divine self remains healthy and strong as long as we acknowledge and repudiate the false idea that the validation of our self-worth is external to our being. Unfortunately, it is true that from an early age we are taught to believe the opinions of others more than our own opinions about ourselves. Our parents, siblings, friends, and teachers, in some cases, all in our young lives, are more esteemed than we are. We are convinced that if someone from these groups disapproves of us, we must respect their point of view about ours. This immersion in the false teachings of the ego gradually erodes our sense of worth, causing us to doubt our divinity. Self-esteem comes from positive beliefs we have internally about ourselves, not from the approval of others. Ego's worldly survival guide dictates that we are physical beings without a core spirituality. It pursues the misconception that our worth is determined by what others choose to think about us. If we really know who we are, we can ignore those ego messages and simply consider the opinions of our fellow men for what they are, simply their opinions. Unfortunately, the ego tries, most of the time, quite successfully, to divert our awareness from our spiritual nature. Unaware of its influence, we spend a lot of time trying to win the approval of everyone we meet. When we don't receive that approval, we begin to internalize those external evaluations and spend much of our lives trying to be what we think someone else wants us to be. Believing that who we are is defined by what other people think of us paralyzes the joyous spontaneity of our authentic selves. If others disapprove and their opinion defines us, then we modify or withdraw from sight. Our image of ourselves is in them, and when they reject us, we no longer are at all. The ego's way of dealing with this dilemma is to adapt to the opinions of others. If they think we are stupid, we try to convince them to think otherwise by trying to be the person they want us to be. We cease to exist except as a reflection of what others think. The fact is, who you are has absolutely nothing to do with any thoughts or opinions that exist in anyone else in this world. Period. That person whose approval he desperately sought might change his mind tomorrow, and instead of thinking that you are smart, talented, and beautiful, you might decide that you are a fool, that it is not attractive to be around. If you listen to your authentic self, these judgments will not affect you at all. However, if your false self dominates your thinking, it will be miserably affected. This is how the ego attracts you to ignore your authentic self. When the search for approval is the guiding principle in life, it is practically impossible to achieve a loving relationship with another human being. We cannot give away what we do not have. We cannot give love and respect to others when we have to find it for ourselves in the judgments of others. The ego contributes to a constant state of fear, confusion, and unhappiness. So what does all this approval seeking and low self-esteem have to do with ambition? The short answer is that we are taught to seek approval and validation from virtually everyone in positions of authority throughout our lives with the greatest ambition possible. Ambition almost always means putting our own life and opinions on the back burner. We learn to please parents, teachers, professors, authority figures, and bosses. And how is this accomplished? By ranking your opinions above ours. This is a process that takes place day after day, month in, month out, and year after year, often on a subconscious level. The result is a false ego-based self. When we give more credence to the opinions of others than to our own self-evaluations, we deny the very wisdom that created us. The more we integrate these selfish beliefs, the more we tend to believe in our own personal importance. Our drive to accumulate and achieve ultimately makes us forget that our intrinsic value is our connection to our spiritual selves. In other words, our connection to our source of being is obscured in favor of indulging the ego's ideas that we are what other people's egos think of us. This has been an important lesson for me to learn over the years. When I speak or write, I find opinions that vary from my own. I know that if I talk to 1,000 people, there will be 1,000 separate opinions about me in that audience. My reputation is not in me, it is in the people who read and listen to what I have to say. Consequently, I have learned not to worry about my reputation. Because it is not located in me, I focus my attention on my own character rather than on how others see me. My main relationship in life is with my source of being, with God, so to speak. Do not imagine that someone can have true faith in God if he does not have faith in himself, is a saying of Paramananda, which resonates strongly with me. If I choose to give up faith in myself by listening to my ego's pleas, then I cannot have faith in my source of being, they are always intertwined. These first three components of the ego, who I am is what I have, what I do, and what others think of me, focus on your desire to build our belief that this universe is about us, as well as that we are qualified as according to how much we accumulate, how much we achieve, and how many merit badges we manage to earn. In other words, our acquisitions, achievements, and reputation are of paramount importance. The next three components of our ego portfolio are organized around the desire to stand out as original, unique, and different from everyone and everything else in the universe. 4. I am separate from everyone else. In the ego sense, ambition wants us to believe that we are the only ones who matter. If we are well indoctrinated in this ego belief, it is very difficult to entertain the idea that the earth exists without us, or that the earth has a reason for being here in the first place. The key word in these final three components of the ego inventory is separation. If we believe that we are separate and distinct from everyone else, we fulfill the program of the false self. But let us remember that we emerged from not being, characterized by unity. Let this statement by Thomas Merton settle within you: we are already one. But we imagine that we are not. And what we have to recover is our original unity. Merton's words ring true and deny the ego's insistent separation edict. The ego insists on separation because that is how it undermines loyalty to the authentic self. When we recognize and respect our connection to each other, the air we breathe, the water we drink and the sun we trust, and, what is more significant, the invisible source that animates us, the ego can return to the space that corresponds to it. Ramana Maharshi's claim that there are no others is delightfully exhilarating and, for me, essentially puts the ego completely out of commission. The ego survives and thrives on the basis of our belief in our separation from others. Separation serves as a motivating factor in our journey of ambition, as it leads us to exercise our comparison mentality with thoughts like, I am prettier, smarter, more talented, a better person, and so on. With this attitude firmly ingrained, we pursue the business of proving our superiority in relation to others. If we are aware that there is no separation or others, we do not need to demonstrate our superiority. In contrast, when our connection to others dominates our beliefs, we don't need to defeat anyone, fight for what we identify as our rights, wage war, take advantage of others, or continually try to be someone in whom we consider a winner. Instead, seeing the development of God in everyone means that there is no conflict, since we see ourselves in others. We understand the wisdom of this observation. When you judge other people, you don't define them, rather, he defines himself as someone who needs to judge. We are unable to grasp the idea of enemy and, consequently, we cannot participate in killing or making war on any member of humanity. As Native Americans love to say, no tree has branches dumb enough to fight each other. The study of human history reveals that we have been at war with each branch of the same tree for more than 95% of recorded history. This is the result of the ego that convinces us that we are separate and we need to fight, control and defeat others who live on the other side of the river, speak a different language, practice a different religion or have different cultural attitudes. The competitiveness, the fights, the scams, the hatred and the conflicts of all descriptions come from the false self that the ego creates when we allow it to convince us that we must preserve the illusion of our separation. Ambition is often an impulse to excel by judging ourselves superior to them. The reality is that we are disguised as them. Instead of noticing our unity, we focus on the difference the ego makes. As Lao Tzu relates in the Tao Te Ching, the treasure is the universal unifying force that is in all things, the omniscient Tao. Regarding the ego's need to believe in separation, the Upanishads say, when for a man who understands, the self has become all things, what a pity, what problem can there be for one who once contemplated that unit? This is illustrated in the movie The Shift. Businessman Chad believes in his separation so much that he runs his company without worrying about its impact on others or the environment. Towards the end of the film, however, he begins to notice the spirit in which Joe, the owner of the resort that Chad and his wife are staying at, serves others. As Chad writes a hefty check to donate to the House of Promise and Hope charity, his smile tells us that he has recognized that there is more to life than making money at the expense of others. 5. I am separated from what is missing in my life. An old tale tells the story of a boy who lived in a small town. This child had avatar qualities and people were healed by being in his presence. Many villagers spoke of his ability to bilocate, to be seen in two different places at precisely the same instant. His countenance was peaceful and radiated calm. The elders of the tribe begged this young avatar to tell them the secrets of God and the universe. One of them pleaded, I will give you an orange if you tell me where God is. The young saint answered without hesitation, I will give you 2 oranges right now if you can tell me where God is not. The fifth component of the ego, our false self, refuses to believe that there is no place where God is not. God is the word I use here in reference to the creative source responsible for all creation. The ego has a vested interest in us believing that things are missing in our life. It insists that we are not connected to an invisible creative source because it gets its identity by pushing God away. If we begin to believe that we are permanently attached to God, the ego's raison d'être disappears. If there is no place where God is not, then God is in each one of us, as well as in everything that our senses interpret as something that is missing in our life. This means that, in some invisible way, we are connected to everything that we perceive to be missing. The question might then be, how do we manifest the things we want that seem to be unavailable? The answer is to realign ourselves in a way that allows what we seek to spiritually harmonize with us. But the ego wants us to fight, set goals, believe in scarcity, compete with all other individuals who are also looking for the same missing things, even fight for them, and eventually emerge as a disgruntled seeker. Why the discontent? Because the method of the ego does not allow to arrive in the sense of living peacefully and happily in the precious present moment. The ego's method is to be ambitious in the sense of always seeking, striving, and wanting more. The ego uses its strength to encourage us to maintain ambitious status. Ego defines ambition as striving to be better than others, winning at all costs, accumulating more, and being seen by others as a brilliant success. Obviously, the ego needs us to reject any idea of being connected in unity with everything that exists in the world. Instead, we must demonstrate our alignment with ambition by having lofty goals and objectives. The bigger the goals, the more status we will acquire as ambitious men and women. And the more we believe that our goals and plans must be big, the more aware we are of what is missing. The ego screams, "Who you are is insufficient. Can't you see that you don't have enough things? Your means of acquiring all the things you need to prove yourself are scarce. If you don't look, someone else will come first. Then you will have to compete with them for the limited amount available." These messages prevent us from living our life from the perspective of our authentic self. Our real selves know that we don't need one more thing to be worthy, and that believing that we need anything else to be happy could be a definition of insanity. He also knows that there is no scarcity in this universe. But the ego is terrified by our belief that abundance and satisfaction are readily available. The ego needs us to be convinced that ambition is a healthy way to calm our discontent with all the things that are lacking in our life. But we will never completely erase that discontent. Ambition in this ego sense can mean spending a lifetime struggling to get somewhere else, which almost instantly will need to upgrade to something else that is missing. This rat race continues, fueled by the idea that there is never enough. However, we have the power to eliminate the ego's crazy fighting ideology and instead live in a state of satisfaction. In the process, our connection to everyone and everything will become clear. Instead of striving for what we perceive to be missing and then being unable to find satisfaction, we can relax in harmony with our source of being. So there is no need to draw God out, as we are resting in unity. There is no need for that troublesome ego. It seems to me that logic would dictate the following. Naturalist John Muir described this phenomenon as follows: when we try to select something for itself, we find it linked to everything else in the universe. We simply must heed this fundamental truth and ignore the ego's insistence that we must try very hard to get what we want. 6. I am separated from God. In this sixth component, the acronym for ego continues to effectively describe our actions of bringing God out by believing that we are not the same as what we came from. The essence of God and our worldly selves remain installed in distinct and separate compartments. Ego is terrified that we believe that we are part of God. His leadership position is doomed if we truly realize our divinity. Naturally, one of the main functions of the ego is to make us believe that we are two very different and separate entities. The collective consciousness of humanity painfully and unnecessarily influences us by believing and behaving like an ego-designed God. Some of the attributes of this ego-designed deity are that he has favorites, yearns for opulence, promotes slaughter and war on their behalf, accepts indulgences for special favors, punishes bad behavior, and needs to be avenged. These and many other attitudes illustrate a God created by the illusions of the collective ego. Throughout history, this man-made, ego-designed creator has been characterized as being separate from us. Who among us has not heard of God portrayed as a dead white man with a long flowing beard, floating around the skies with supernatural powers, watching over us like a cosmic button who will sometimes answer our prayers, depending on his whims and if we have you obeyed their rules. This entity is not seen as an all-giving divine source, but rather as a temperamental superpower that retains his ability to solve our problems or heal our illnesses depending on whether he is in the mood to grant us a special dispensation. This is an ego creator, invented by the ego and dedicated to satisfying the ego's demands. This is a creator who must, by virtue of his own ego, be separate from the subjects that he must monitor, control, and punish when necessary. What does it take to get out of this damaging belief system? Certainly burning the ego, as Ramana Maharshi suggests in the opening quote of this chapter, is symbolically attractive. In the movie The Shift, I suggest thinking about our relationship with God or the Great Tao by imagining the ocean as a symbol of God, and ourselves symbolized by a small glass of ocean water. If they ask us what is in the glass, we would say, a glass of God. It is not that big or that strong, but it is a glass of God. If we empty the glass of water on the sidewalk, we will see it disappear while it vaporizes. Ultimately, it would go back to its origin. While the ocean water is in the glass, separated from its source, it lacks the power of the ocean. But when it rejoins its source, it becomes part of the mighty ocean again. That the water on the sidewalk has lost its connection with its source is a symbol of the ego. In the second half of this book, we will discover how to keep our connection to source and our authentic self in shape in this world. We will learn how to move from the ambition of the ego and its inevitable evaporation of power to the unity of joyous meaning, where we realize that we are much more than our possessions, achievements, and reputations. The change to meaning removes our feelings of separation and illuminates our spiritual connection. Totally unprepared, we step into the afternoon of life. Worse still, we take this step with the false assumption that our truths and ideals will serve us as they have been. But we cannot live the afternoon of life according to schedule of life tomorrow, because what was great in the morning, little in the afternoon, and what was true in the morning, in the evening will become a lie. From the Stages of Life, by Carl Jung. The title of this chapter signifies the step we take from the demands of the ego, the false self that thrives on ambition, to the authentic self, that thrives and feeds on purpose. Jung uses the morning of life as a metaphor to illustrate that from the beginning we allow the ego to be the dominant influence. However, there comes a time for everyone when the influence of the ego is so inauthentic and inappropriate as to be a lie. Carl Jung is telling us that all the truths and ideals that we learn over the years of building a belief in the false self are ineffective guides to the evening and night of life. The change begins between the morning call and the afternoon, when we begin to yearn to find something more in our existence. Then we begin the movement toward a life that is governed by the call of our soul for something more, something with a purpose, rather than the few illusory offerings of the ego. Jung further warns us that the ego's guidance is ultimately false when applied to the evening and night metaphor. This chapter explores altering the direction the ego wants us to take, making a U-turn back to our deity. Still very much alive, we simply set out on the path to the fulfillment of our dharma, the meaning of our life. The U-turn is a change from ambition to our place of origin to fulfill the promise of the evening and the night of our lives. That promise is a life saturated with purpose. Making the U-turn. The direction we take in life is much more significant than where our ego parks us, in the present moment. For example, asking about the direction we are going is more valuable than focusing on how much we weigh or when we smoke our last cigarette. Committing to change a self-sabotaging lifestyle is committing to change direction, and then we move on to weight loss or addiction control. Moving towards something with more purpose and meaning is even more meaningful. If we persistently listen to the demands of the ego, we drift away from our source of being. The ego insists on pursuing more things, achievements, status, triumphs and money. More is the ego's mantra, fueling endless effort with a false promise of finally arriving. However, each assured arrival point is seductively transformed into a desire to fight even more, unless we decide to make a change in the direction our life is taking. Change begins in the process of stopping the ego's drive and self-importance, but then we must continue the work of derailing it and diverting it in the opposite direction. This does not mean that we lose our momentum, rather, it means that our drive is realigned with a life based on experiencing meaning and feeling determined. Ambition is now fueled by our source of being, and it is vibrating at a higher frequency than the ego-fueled false self. Returning to our natural source, the deity that I described earlier as our point of origin leads us toward a way of life that supports the potential fullness that we are. Here are some of the signs of our readiness to make a U-turn from ambition to meaning. The ego's repetitive insistence to do and have more becomes less attractive. Instead, we begin to notice an interest in where we are going. Although this may be a grammatically incorrect construction, it is a necessary emphasis in light of the title of this chapter. Gradually, we can hear a part of ourselves whispering questions like, is this all there is? What's it all about? And what's the point? We begin to question the part of the ego that seems to be in charge, telling ourselves that life is about what we do and have. We begin to direct our attention to our source, which says the opposite. The Tao Te Ching instructs us to let go of everything, to eliminate our attachments. This part of verse 81 talks particularly about challenging the voice of the ego. We realize that life begins to take a different direction when we head back home in this metaphorical sense. We begin to understand that we have more by letting go of the need to acquire and accumulate. This same point is underscored in my movie, when Chad, the CEO, detaches himself from his desire to acquire while writing his donation check for the House of Hope and Promise. This is followed by a scene in which he gives his wife wild roses, symbolizing his decision to change the course of his life. Changing direction from an inauthentic existence to an authentic one does not mean that we can no longer attract abundance and prosperity, or that we lose our desire to be productive. It means that we feel the natural bliss of being in tune with our wholeness. We began to go from doing more to doing less. Our source of being encourages us to be like the Tao and to do less. Lao Tzu affirms that by doing nothing, everything is done. Likewise, Jesus tells us, behold the birds of the sky, they neither sow, nor reap, nor gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them, Matthew 6:26. This change is away from the ambition to win the whole world, to which Jesus refers when he asks, what good is it for man to win the whole world and lose his own soul? Mark 8:36. In Two's journey, that is, back to our original nature, we do more than the recovery movement teaches in the sense of letting go and letting go of God. Without pushing ourselves to achieve at all costs, we reach the wonderful position of achieving more and ultimately feel more important in our life. We began to avoid the spotlight and to work more from the shadows. Our source of being says that humility should be our primary focus. But for years, the ego has been effectively convincing us that we should focus on acquiring a reputation for being an ambitious person. In the shift from ambition to meaning, we absorb the truth of the Tao and are drawn to statements like this from verse 73, it is the way of heaven to conquer without striving. Our desire to receive praise changes to the opposite of the ego's edicts. Similarly, Jesus speaks in opposition to the ego when he says, for the least of you all, that is the greatest, Luke 9:48. Imagine the difficulty the ego has when we begin to practice this kind of radical humility. The ego thrives on the approval of others and the compliments that come to us, so it is not surprising that we learn to adopt an approval-seeking lifestyle. We have sought approval since we were little. However, as we reverse our direction and begin to diminish our self-importance, we become independent of the good or bad opinions of others. The belief in unity replaces our belief in separation. The ego has long insisted that we are separate from everyone else and therefore special. The stubborn conviction in separation has meant that we constantly compare ourselves to each other and compete for what we want. We have learned to fight and even go to war if necessary to uphold that notion. Conflict is a necessary part of the ego's belief in separation, and the need to dominate and destroy others is an integral part of this mindset. As we return to our fromness, a sense of unity begins to replace separation. Our source of being tells us that we are all connected, so we begin to feel less competitive, our desire to dominate is replaced by compassion, and controlling others is no longer attractive. The language of the Spirit instructs us, in the language of the Tao Te Ching, to never think of conquering others by force. Any tight tension will soon ebb. It is not in tune with the way. All conflicts, whether in our personal life or in the world at large, arise from moving away from our source of being. Thanks to its belief in separation, the ego directs us toward strength rather than empowerment. Jesus are once again in harmony with the ancient Tao, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God," Matthew 5:9. One of the characters in the shift is completely attuned to his unity with the others. His name is Joe, and at first it is not clear if he is a janitor, gardener, or perhaps a waiter. But your ego is obviously unpretentious. He functions in a calm, sensitive and sincerely cheerful manner in the service of all the guests of the resort. Meaning and purpose have superseded any need for Joe's ambition and control. Throughout the film, it illustrates the kind of behavior that occurs when we are aware of the unity that unites us. We begin to realize that we are connected in spirit to everything that we perceive as missing in our life. During the morning of life, the ego has insisted that we are separated from all that is missing in our life and that we must pursue our desires. It pushes us to push ourselves, fight, work hard, and apply a decidedly ambitious approach to life. He insists that this is how we get our peers to see us as successful. Convinced that we are separated, we come to the conclusion that what is missing is due to our separation. However, we come from a unit where there is no such thing. Our source of being gently reminds us that we are connected to everything, so we must be connected to what we believe is missing. This chapter emphasizes that we change or regress towards something with which the ego is not familiar. The Tao Te Ching reminds us that the great Tao is omnipresent, which means that there is no place where it is not. And Jesus proclaims, "The kingdom of God is within you," Luke 17:21. The ego, on the other hand, defines separation as separation from everything that we cannot grasp with our senses. When we return in the direction of where we reconnect with our source of being, the journey is characterized by an alignment in which we think and act as the Tao that flows everywhere. The Tao that covers all creatures like the sky, but does not dominate them. All things return to him as home, but he does not rule over them. As we move in this direction, there is no possibility of scarcity or scarcity. We are happy and grateful for everything we have. We begin to trust the wisdom that created us. The ego constantly dissuades us from believing in our divinity, insisting that we are separated from God. Our source of being, however, tells us that we are an inseparable piece of God. If we believe, as Jesus taught, that I and the Father are one, John 10:30, then there would be no need for the ego. As we embark on our return journey, we see the insanity of continuing to believe that our source of being could ever be separated from us. We know that we are not distinct and fearful creatures who depend on a temperamental and sometimes malevolent God for our sustenance. We begin to see ourselves as Lao Tzu describes, carry body and soul and embrace the one. We abandon the focus of the material ego and can no longer see ourselves separated from God. As we become one with our source, we begin the process of realignment, thinking and contemplating more like God. We gain the wisdom necessary to understand these words written by Thomas Troward: "If you contemplate with thoughts that coincide with the original spirit, you have the same power as the original spirit." This idea is anathema to the ego. But the wholeness, the unity, that we really are, is revealed when we begin to trust the wisdom that created us. What to expect when we change the course of our life? As with anything new, going from the morning of life to the afternoon and then into the evening will produce some surprising situations. This new direction, from ambition to meaning, is often accompanied by an unexpected event. I discovered that every spiritual advance I made was preceded by some kind of fall. In fact, it is almost a universal law that a fall of some kind precedes a major change. A fall can be an embarrassing event that reveals the exaggerated influence the ego has been allowed to play in one's life, which certainly happened to me when I was asked to end my association with alcohol. Other types of falls can involve an accident, a fire that destroys all the things we have worked so hard to accumulate, an illness, a failed relationship, a death or injury that causes deep pain, abandonment, a serious addiction, a business failure, bankruptcy, or the like. These low points actually provide the energy needed to make a change in direction from an ego-driven life to a purpose-filled one. When he was in high school, he was the high jumper on the men's track team. To propel myself over the bar, I would approach the high jump pit and go down as low as I could. In the process of coming down so low, I was creating the necessary position to propel myself high enough to navigate the bar. For me, this is a symbol of what happens before a change. In a metaphorical sense, going down can mean that we are low enough to access the energy necessary to change the direction of life. Each fall has the potential to take us to a higher place. It may be necessary to get dirty in the dark night of the soul to free ourselves from the clutches of a well-established ego. Hidden in all misfortune is good fortune is a concept of Tao that seems to support the value of those moments in life when we have experienced a fall. Without that particular misfortune, good fortune is not available. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross places these events in the category of nature's work. If I protected the canyons from windstorms, I would never see the beauty of their carvings. The windstorms of life are potentially significant events and we can use them to propel ourselves to higher places. In fact, my opinion is that the higher the purpose we sign up for in life, the bigger and harder the falls we encounter. A mild heart attack helped me feel more concerned about the suffering of others. Being in a series of foster homes taught me self-reliance as a child, which consequently led me to become a self-reliance teacher. A deeply painful separation from my wife allowed me to write from a more compassionate heart. I came here to accomplish great things, see. Therefore, I am not at all surprised when challenges and falls come in large doses. In fact, I now feel that any great challenge is an opportunity to grow to a higher spiritual level, where gratitude gradually replaces regret. I love this observation from Rumi, which reveals what I consider to be essential truth. This has been my experience looking back and seeing how I made a change in direction and went from ambition to meaning. All the falls unearthed a treasure in me that would not have been usable if my home had not been destroyed. Those storms of life helped sculpt the work that is cherished by millions of readers and listeners. Each of the characters in the movie The Shift experiences an ego digging that precedes their own shift toward a more meaningful life. David, the filmmaker, nearly collapses when he receives a blow that destroys his visions of success. Chad, the CEO, faces the wrath of his pregnant wife, risking his marriage over his ego posture. And then there are Quinn and Jason, a couple with 2 young children. Jason grapples with the issue of becoming a temporary homemaker to help Quinn fulfill her dharma as an artist. The fact is that all these falls, minor or catastrophic, are experiences that can be turning points that elevate the consciousness of these individuals to a place where importance and purpose are the touchstones of their lives. Each of the ego's components makes completely different demands than our source of being makes. Spirit calls us home to perfect alignment with our Creator. The ego is moving at great speed in the opposite direction. We must become better acquainted with Spirit if we wish to turn 180 degrees while we are still alive, and fully experience the afternoon of life. Preparing to make the U-turn. The Bhagavad Gita tells us, we are born in the world of nature, our second birth is in the world of spirit. Tame the influence of the ego is the beginning of that second birth. By taming the ego, we gain the support and help of our original spirit, and we come to notice the synchronicities that occur in our lives. People we need appear, circumstances come together in a way that helps us on our dharma path, funding is available that has never existed before, and so on. In the words of Patanjali, sleeping strengths, abilities, and talents come to life, and you discover that you are a much greater person than you ever dreamed of being. This great Hindu philosopher is referring to what happens when we move into a spiritual mindset, rather than an egocentric one. What previously seemed non-existent suddenly comes alive. This is the result of reversing the course of life and knowing where we are going, the title of this chapter. The most important thing we can do to deactivate the influence of the ego is to proclaim ourselves ready. Remember the old saying that instructs, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. The teachers and the teachings are always there, throughout our entire life. But when the ego runs things, those teachers go unnoticed. Once we truly recognize our willingness to live a purposeful and meaningful life, there is very little to do. We begin to live in a different world than the one we experience in our ego-directed person. As I have written and said many times, when we change the way we look at things, the things we look at change. Briefly summarizing, this is what happens when the ego turns in a U and heads towards our place of origin. The 7-step summary of our U-turn. 1. We move on to personal empowerment. Our selfish selves have always focused on external power. However, as we move towards spirit, we replace the ego's need to influence external situations or other people with a preference for personal empowerment. We stop fighting the endless battles of the ego and instead switch to the meaning. We do this through conscious compassionate curiosity and by caring first and foremost about our inner selves. Non-interference becomes a higher priority than being right or dominating others. 2. We see ourselves connected to everyone. The ego feels separate and distinct from others, a being in itself. As we return to spirit, we recognize our connection. The essence of living a life on purpose is to think as God thinks, and the creative source of all life is just that, responsible for all life. We all share the same source and have the same destiny. Seeing ourselves as part of everyone eliminates the need to compete with anyone. 3. We are motivated by ethics, serenity, and quality of life. The ego is motivated by external accomplishments, performance, and acquisitions. As we return to spirit, we shift our focus to inner seeking. Our preparation to live a purposeful life involves a major attitude shift in the direction of feeling at peace, being honest, and helping others. 4. We move on to the possibility, even the expectation, that miracles are part of life. As we move towards the original spirit, the ego's investment in a scientific interpretation of the cause and effect of life is diluted. We acknowledge the presence of the mysterious and unfathomable, and we renounce skepticism by relying less on our senses and much more on our intuitive knowing. 5. We follow a meditation practice. The ego avoids the practice of meditation and often labels it as a waste of time or worse, insane. Shifting to our source of being leads us to seek silence to consciously contact God as a natural component of a meaningful life. 6. We begin to recognize ourselves in the beauty and complexity of nature. The ego's interest in contemplating the beauty of nature is minimal. When we travel back in the direction of the spirit, our interest in miracles that appear in the natural world is endless. Hence our preference for living in harmony with this universe, rather than exerting influence and power over it. 7. We are less critical and easily understand and forgive. The ego is quite adamant about the importance of seeking revenge. Switching to the source gives us opportunities to practice forgiveness. Pursuing and achieving revenge, retaliation keeps us from feeling determined and living a meaningful life. We become truly sensitive to the edict that we do not define others with our judgments, we are simply defining ourselves as people who need to judge. These 7 distinctions between ego ambitions and the desire to live a meaningful life could easily be extended to 70 times 7. Essentially, the process of change to meaning involves reconsidering our role in this magnificent and mysterious universe from a spiritual perspective. We recognize our longing for more meaning and purpose, and we realize that the ego is unable to satisfy that longing. Whether personally expressed or not, we cannot achieve the authenticity of the false self, which is the ego. This is entertainingly illustrated by the personal stories of David, Chad, and Quinn in the film version of The Shift. We see them in their frustration of ceaselessly striving, which is the path of ambition in a self-centered life, and we watch them as they shift to meaning and consequently discover the joy of arriving. In the movie, the ego loses its influence as each of these characters tires of continually striving and never getting there. One sign that dimension A of change is upon us is that we, like the three central characters in the film, are beginning to tire of the anguish of continually fighting and never coming. Our view of our world changes as we allow quantum moments to capture and then hold our attention. Quantum moments can change life. I'm talking about the quantum moments in the movie, along with the fact that they have been reported by thousands of people who have experienced a shift in their consciousness about life. These people have moved from an ego-driven perspective of life to a balanced spiritual one and have become more authentic beings. There are 4 qualities that help us recognize a quantum moment, the kind with the potential to introduce ourselves to our authentic selves. In their book, Quantum Change, When Epiphanies and Sudden Insights Transform Ordinary Lives, authors William R. Miller and Janet C. DeBacca state that quantum change is a vivid, surprising, benevolent, and lasting personal transformation. Note that italics are courtesy of the authors of Quantum Change. What follows is how I view those 4 qualities, in a slightly different order, in relation to our shift from ambition to meaning. 1. Amazing. It may sound counterintuitive to plan to be surprised, but everyone reports that quantum moments are unexpected, uninvited, and unforeseen. This is when synchronicity and chance collaborate to amaze us. It's like we give up and let ourselves live for life. We become the student who is ready and, in fact, the teacher appears. However, this is usually preceded by a fall. At the beginning of this chapter, I wrote about the falls we usually suffer before any kind of spiritual advancement. The universe seems to work this way, and I could count many examples from my own life. As I mentioned earlier, my final decision to live a life without alcohol involved a quantum moment that totally surprised me. On that particular day, I woke up at 4:07 a.m. with a voice, a slight smell of roses in the room, and an overwhelming sense of being in the presence of divine energy. There seemed to be a slight breeze in my closed bedroom, and while I was paralyzed and feeling a sensation of goosebumps all over my body, I was also in a daze from what was happening at the time. The voice told me that I was done with alcohol and that it would be easy to quit. 2 decades have passed and I can honestly report that what I was told was 100% true. I was never tempted to include alcohol in my life again. This was a total surprise to me. However, as I moved in the direction of spirit, over the years, I had many of these surprises, which attracted my attention and brought me to a greater spiritual awareness. 2. Alive. These quantum moments that turn life upside down are also characterized by being extremely intense. Even to this day, I can remember every detail of that spectacular quantum moment that occurred when I quit drinking. The sheets on the bed, the clothes hanging from the top of my closet door, a little cartoon taped to a mirror above my dresser, the coin container on the floor, the color of the walls, a scratch mark on my bedside. Everything is as vivid to me today as it was more than 20 years ago. It seems to me that when spirit calls, it creates an exclamation point to emphasize the whole episode. There is a vividness that stays with us forever. 3. Benevolent. The third quality of these quantum moments is that they are benevolent. For example, the early morning adventure I have just related was one of the most peaceful and happy moments I have ever experienced. The tranquility that embraced me was like being cradled in the arms of a truly loving and generous Creator. For years I had thought about my dependence on a few beers every night. He would try to remember a day when he hadn't had a beer in the evening and couldn't remember a day in the previous decade or possibly more. I told myself that it was not a dependency because I never got drunk or put myself or anyone else in danger from driving under the influence. However, in my private place of truth, I knew that I was relying on this beer drinking activity and that it was interfering with my life in potentially harmful ways. However, I still persisted, that is, until my downfall and the quantum moment. To this day, I recount that morning encounter with what was like one of the most enthusiastic and serene moments of my life. The experience of the benevolence of a quantum moment moved me into a totally new world where meaning replaced the ambition of the ego. 4. Long-lasting. The fourth quality of a quantum moment is that it never goes away. The enduring truth of my example is that I am in my third decade of total abstinence. If I had continued on my same path of drinking beer, it is very likely that I would not have lived long enough to write what I am telling you now. When we are in the process of changing our lives to reflect the meaning rather than the ambition of the ego, we will have a quantum moment that is surprising, vivid, benevolent and long-lasting. That moment will be etched into our consciousness in a vivid image that will not be forgotten. I have heard it described as a warm shower running inside you, the graceful imprint of which endures to infinity. How life changes after a quantum moment experience. My early books focus almost exclusively on psychological tools to help readers use effective common sense approaches to problem solving. There are no references to God or a higher self in the first 15 years or so of my publishing history. Today, my values and my writing reflect the shift from ambition to meaning that took place later in my life and writing career. If I had tried to live the evening of my life according to the program of the morning of my life, I would have been living a lie, as Carl Jung points out in the last sentence of the quotation that opens this chapter. Before those quantum moments, my ego shaped my life much more. They would likely have responded like the men and women who participated in the studies reported in Quantum Change. After asking individuals to define what effect their experiences of quantum momentum had on their lives, the authors concluded that the value system of the person was often the other way around. The top 5 values for men before their quantum moment were wealth, adventure, achievement, pleasure, and being respected. I interpret them as the values of tomorrow, before the change from ambition to meaning. Judgment is not intended here. These qualities are simply what the ego has been taught to believe is important and necessary for success. Early in life, men learn that their job is to make money and its value depends on how much money they have accumulated. Men growing into adulthood in an ego-emphasizing society consistently report similar shared values. A man believes that he must amass wealth, have adventures, achieve at all costs, and seek pleasure by becoming the most important person in all respects, especially when it comes to intimacy. I first. As long as I feel pleasure, everything is fine. And the need to be respected at all costs is a key reason for the conflicts raging in our male-dominated and war-torn world. What these same men, and I include myself with, report as primary values after a quantum moment is one of the shift's main messages. The top priority for these men was a value that did not appear anywhere on the list when they were in the morning of their lives: spirituality. That's right, after a move into the afternoon of life, spirituality tops the list. In fact, Quantum Change reports that the 5 characteristics most valued with that original group of men were now: spirituality, personal peace, family, God's will and honesty. It's easy to understand why a quantum moment would be considered to turn life upside down. This is a complete change from the pleas of the ego and back home to desire a life of peace, family, love, and personal honesty realized by God. For women, stepping away from the ego-driven messages of the morning is just as fascinating. When asked to prioritize their values in the pre-quantum moment, their number 1 value was family. This is not surprising because women have been programmed to believe that being a mother/daughter/wife supersedes everything else. This is not intended to denigrate the female roles of mother, daughter, sister, grandmother, etc. Rather, I want to give credit to the fact that being a woman is more than just being someone else's to-do list. Every woman has a dharma. However, quite often, he relegates his personal dharma to an unimportant state compared to his family roles. The next highest pre-quantum values were independence, career, adaptation, and attractiveness. This attitude is dramatically characterized in the film when Sarah describes the conflicts that women experience. They want to be good mothers, but independence and a career are at the top of their list of values. Also, before a quantum experience, they rank fitting in and being attractive as very high priorities. But after making the switch to the afternoon of life, which is often aided by a surprising quantum moment experience, women report that their values take on a whole new flavor. According to Quantum Change, personal growth topped the list in post-quantum questioning of women, followed by self-esteem, spirituality, happiness, and generosity, 5 things that weren't even on the list on the morning of her life. Women. As the women in the studies became more aware of their spiritual nature, their concept of themselves began to change. Previously, things like spirituality and self-esteem were not considered important values. But after their quantum moments, they were given an entirely new set of values and propelled in a new direction, the afternoon of purposeful living. I congratulate William R. Miller and Janet C. Tabaka for their groundbreaking research, and I highly recommend that you refer to their book. I guarantee you will find it as fascinating as I am. It is appropriate to end this chapter titled 2, which means the new direction of our lives when we are open to change, with the last words of Carl Jung's quote at the beginning of this chapter, "So it was great in the morning. It will be small at sunset, and what was true in the morning will become a lie in the evening." Our life, and the lives of those we impact, will be devoid of lies as we shed our false selves and shift into evening and night. This is the subject of the next and final chapter, entitled Meaning. Life is meaningless, unless it serves an end beyond itself, unless it is of value to someone else. Abraham Joshua Heschel. The only possible way to give meaning to man's existence is to elevate his natural relationship with the world to a spiritual one. Albert Schweitzer. Here we are at the end, which ironically turns out to be identical to where we originated from. Our goal on this journey from ambition to meaning has been to return to where we originated from, and in the words of T.S. Eliot, knows the place for the first time. We come from a place with no place of purpose and meaning. At birth we assume a false self known as the ego, and we spend a period of our lives striving to fulfill its lofty desires. Then we made a change of address and started heading home. Here we are in the meaningful afternoon of life, the place where, to paraphrase Emmanuel's quote at the beginning of the book, when we get home, every breath we take is an expression of our life purpose. We no longer fight to win, obtain the approval of others, meet the expectations that others had for us, fulfill another's idea of our dharma, or acquire, achieve, or accumulate. We let go of the conflict, the certainty, being right, fighting, dominating, winning and feeling superior. This whole ego business loses its power and attraction when we get home, where the meaning welcomes us. Many years ago, after a conversation with my friend Ram Das, I wrote these words: "All my life I wanted to be someone. Now I am finally someone, but it is not me. I struggled to become someone everyone admired for all his ego strengths, vast accomplishments, accumulation of wealth, and badges of merit around the house. However, I finally realized that it was not me. The components of the ego were well established, but I had miles to go before I could truly say, I am living my dharma. I am doing it on purpose, and my life means something." The quote from Abraham Heschel at the beginning of this chapter explains what was missing. It points out that significance is not available unless one's life serves an end beyond itself, unless it is of value to someone else. That someone I wanted to be, who, by all accounts, I had actually become, was not the real me. I came to this world, like you and everyone else, with nothing, that is, without things. I will leave this world the same way, with nothing. My conclusion? Since we cannot keep anything that we achieve or accumulate, the only thing we can do with our life is give it away. Albert Schweitzer, a man whom I greatly admire, explains in the second quotation that opens this chapter that the way to give meaning to life is to raise our consciousness to a spiritual rather than a material consciousness. This means learning to think like God thinks, which I emphasize throughout this book and in my movie. This is the great change, to move away from the ego and return to the unity of the spirit, while keeping the false self alive but dead. Preparing for a meaningful life. How do we live our lives in this egoless home? As you may suspect, Lao Tzu offers us some clues as to how this is accomplished. First, point out what it takes to feel the sensation of heaven on earth referred to as immortality. Mystical techniques for achieving immortality are revealed only to those who have dissolved all ties to the dense worldly realm of duality, conflict, and dogma. As long as your superficial worldly ambitions exist, the door will not open. If we cannot at least initiate this process, in other words, we are left with the frustrations of the ego and the door to immortality simply will not open. To live a life of meaning, we must do a radical egectomy and dissolve our ties with what Lao Tzu calls the world of 10,000 things. As he advises, when you succeed in connecting your energy with the divine realm through high awareness and indiscriminate virtue practice, the transmission of the latest subtle truths will follow. Have the opportunity to receive guidance from beyond ourselves. So we know what a purposeful and meaningful life feels like on a daily basis. It's never about the ego. Lao Tzu knew this truth 2,500 years ago, and Jesus reminded us of it 500 years later in the teachings of the New Testament. A meaningful life celebrates the perfection of ourselves and nature. We are in harmony with everyone and everything we around us. However, this harmonious state cannot be achieved when we adopt the characteristics of the ego. In order to enter a life of spirit and purpose, we have to lay down our life. This is a concept that the ego will ridicule, even working overtime to convince us that it will have disastrous consequences. Real wonders, how can I serve? Ego's attitude, on the other hand, is, give me, give me, give me, I need more and I can never be satisfied. When we align ourselves with the voice of the ego, the universe provides experiences that match the energy of give me, give me, give me. It may not seem obvious at first, but if we pay attention, it becomes quite clear that this energy generates pressure, anxiety, and stress. Why? Because allying with the ego means that we have chosen to live in a demanding environment. We just haven't realized that we have a choice to join forces with our true ideals and live in a non-demanding environment. The law of attraction works either way. The more we demand of the universe, the more it is demanded of us. The more we give away, the more we get. It is really a simple matter of attitudinal energy generated from within. Constantly thinking about needing more draws that needed energy back to us. However, when we constantly generate thoughts of giving, we attract the energy of giving back. Returning to Lao Tzu, he notes, it is entirely possible for you to achieve immortality and experience absolute joy and freedom forever. The practice of indiscriminate virtue is the means to this end. By practicing kindness and selflessness, you naturally align your life with the integral way. The shift is a contemporary interpretation of this ancient teaching. I hope to impart to you that meaning is not achieved through your ego and your selfish ways, but through the part of yourself that is selfless. In the previous verse, Lao Tzu talks about practicing indiscriminate virtue. This is his path to the freedom and joy that characterize a purposeful life. The four cardinal virtues that make up our original nature. There is a book I love called Hua Hu Qing, The Unknown Teachings of Lao Tzu by Brian Walker. In these pages, Lao Tzu mentions four cardinal virtues that are part of our original nature. These virtues must be practiced if we want to know the truth of our universe and achieve a life of meaning while in bodily form. While Brian Walker has done a masterful job on his book, I'd like to expand on each of these virtues, one by one. Here they are, with a detailed explanation. 1. Reverence for all life. We start life this way, but then we allow the ego to engage us with complexity. Their demands take the joy out of our days. Always trying to get somewhere or acquire more is a tiring undertaking. Ultimately, wishing for meaning, we return to the place of our original nature. It seems that such a return must have led Voltaire to observe the following. One always starts with the simple, then comes the complex, and through higher illumination often goes back to the simple at the end. That is the course of human intelligence. Point 4. When we return to our Godhead, a sense of wonder fills us with energy. The mysterious is welcome rather than avoided, and we find renewed pleasure in the simplest activities. We no longer want others to be what they are not. In the meaning phase of life, we remove the complexities that the ego has imposed on us, and the reverence we feel is often an intensely stimulating sense of wonder we notice in nature. There is a newly experienced delight in listening to the howling of the wind, watching the storms rage, and appreciating that bees and butterflies do their job of pollinating flowers. The first cardinal virtue is manifested as unconditional love and respect for ourselves and for others. When we worship all of life, the desire to interfere, dominate, or control someone is non-existent. We adhere to these sweet words of the poet Robert Frost: we love the things we love for what they are. When we practice this first cardinal virtue, we don't ask that people, or anything else for that matter, live up to our expectations, which is what the ego loves to do. There are two ways to have the tallest building in the city. One is the ego way, which is to tear down the other buildings until you have the tallest. The problem with this method is that it creates a constant conflict. People dislike when their achievements have been destroyed or diminished. Anger is the first response, followed by the force, which faces the counterforce, and soon an all-out war will be fought. This is the form of eagerness, reverence, or love for the achievements of others, just a need to compete and emerge victorious to proclaim superiority. In fact, the ego is always looking for someone with the recklessness to try to overcome it. The second way to have the tallest building in the city is the way of the Spirit, which offers meaning over ambition. In this way, he urges us to put energy into our own building and to respect the efforts of others to do the same. No need to compete or succeed. There is no force, which always results in counterforce. Reverence for all life implies love and respect for each of God's creatures, the planet, and the universe as well. When we practice this first cardinal virtue, we are at peace with the world and with ourselves. In the meaning phase of life, we replace the struggle to be ourselves, to be lived by the great Tao. 2. Natural sincerity. The second cardinal virtue speaks of honesty in our daily life. This does not necessarily mean that we will refrain from breaking the rules, rather, we guide ourselves to enjoy an existence characterized by authenticity. In the ego-driven ambition phase, our false or inauthentic self is essentially in charge. It is then that our idea of who we are is based on accumulating, achieving, gaining approval and enhancing our separation as an emblem of our superiority. It is impossible to be sincere by nature if we try to be someone other than who we really are, which is what happens when the ego rules. As William Shakespeare says in Hamlet, God has given you one face and you make yourself another. When you alter your face to fit your ego image of who you are, you lose the ability to be naturally sincere. This quality results when you allow others to get to know you, without being afraid or worrying about how they perceive you. His speech and behavior basically send this message. This is who I am. I came to this world with an inner call to fulfill a destiny that will never be silenced. This provocative line, attributed to children's author Dr. Seuss, underscores the meaning of the second cardinal virtue: be who you are and say what you feel, because those who matter don't matter and those who matter don't. It doesn't matter. It's so true, those who matter won't care about your natural sincerity. However, they will absolutely enjoy that you fulfill an inner sense of purpose and live a meaningful life. They want you to experience the joy of exploring and becoming more than you are, rather than striving to get somewhere or become someone you really are not. I often talk to people who are sadly out of sync with their original nature. They describe unhappiness and frustration with their jobs, detest the suits and ties they must wear, the hours they must meet, and the people they work with. In general, these individuals live from a very dishonest place, driven by factors that they believe define them. Of course, when asked if they are honest, they insist that they are. But the truth is that their lives are often meaningless and do not have the feeling of fulfilling a dharma that they came to actualize. I always invite men and women who find themselves in this situation to reflect on this thorough quote, which encourages natural sincerity. If you confidently walk in the direction of your dreams, and strive to live the life you have imagined, you will meet unexpected success at ordinary hours. Don't ask what the world needs, don't ask what others think you should be doing with your life. Instead, ask yourself what brings you to life, because more than anything else, what the world really needs are men and women who have come to life. What the world needs is the natural sincerity of people who live their passion in a way that improves other people's lives. This is what appears to be authentic, and this, in my humble opinion, is what Lao Tzu meant when he called this second cardinal virtue of natural sincerity something that manifests as honesty and determination to be true to the true ones, the most authentic self. 3. Gentleness. The third cardinal virtue to live from a position of meaning points to kindness and consideration for others. As you already know, this is not the ego style. The false self is constantly on the prowl to exert power over others, as it feels separate. You are also threatened by the competitive nature of all your relationships, and the need to exert force comes from that, and then of course the inevitable counter-force erupts when egos collide. Our higher self does not feel threatened by others because it does not accept the concept of separation. By not feeling separate, our desire for a purposeful life nurtures a sense of oneness with all other beings. This feeling of connection flows in the direction of compassion. Ultimately, we approach the world with gentleness, humility, and kindness because we have returned to our original nature. In the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., we are caught in an inescapable web of reciprocity, tied in a single garment of destiny. Anything that affects one directly affects everyone indirectly. We will not experience the meaning while we are focused on the violence. Thinking about conquering and defeating others, no matter how compelling the reasons, prevents us from exercising the sweetness of our original nature. As the Tao Te Ching tells us, weapons are destined for destruction and the wise must avoid them. Weapons are not limited to instruments of death, they are also the words and actions we use. Considering the importance of meekness to living a meaningful life, we see how it leads us towards unity. Both Lao Tzu and Jesus observed the constant warfare that existed between individuals and communities and exhorted us to go with our higher nature if we desire meaning and purpose in our lives. How many people have perished because of the inhumanity of man towards man, which is the work of the false self? And for what? So many innocent beings in the ancient villages have been slaughtered by who will rule the land, occupy the hilltop, or own the kingdom. A look at history reveals centuries of violence, the 20th century being the most violent of all. And where are we today? Have we finally found a way to live together as one, as our higher nature implores us to do? We build weapons and store them in silos and submarines with the potential to end life on our planet for centuries to come. This absurdity results from the fact that many of us act exclusively under the directives of our ego. We need to move away from those perverse ego ambitions toward an existence that is more meaningful to all of us on planet Earth. If we make that change and extend kindness and gentleness while avoiding violence, we will feel the difference in our lives. We will feel that we are finally at home, thinking and acting as our source of being. We will feel a true purpose. We will feel the joyous authenticity of a life based on meaning. 4. Support. The fourth cardinal virtue informs us that we are eternally supported in the process of living authentically. We let go of the ambition imposed by the ego and we relax into the meaning that sustains our particular life. Support manifests itself as a service to others without expecting a reward or even a thank you. It is the quintessential component of feeling that life has a purpose. It is the surest way to learn to think as God thinks, which was Albert Einstein's main motivation in trying to unravel the mystery of creation. When we see ourselves as individualized, divine expressions of God, we are more inclined to want to understand how the creative force operates. What does God do with his hands? Do you ask for a special treatment? Ask for help? Do you expect us to be grateful? Does he keep things for himself? Are you concerned about how your work is judged? They are questions acquired from the false self, questions for which we create myths and stories to answer. However, the real answer to these rhetorical questions is, the only thing God does with his hands is give, create, and offer over and over again. That's it. This fourth cardinal virtue tells us that our original nature and purpose of life is like the sun. If we ask the sun why it always gives light, surely its answer would be, it is my nature to do so. The only thing we can do with life is give it away. Anything and everything else in the way of achievements or acquisitions means nothing in the context of our purpose as spiritual beings having a human experience. We don't attract what we want, we attract what we are. The prayer of Saint Francis of Assisi makes it clear that it is by giving that we receive. Giving aligns us with the way our source of being acts, consequently, the universe offers us experiences that match our generous and supportive nature. Earlier, I described how the universe responds to us with the same vibrational energy that we send out. How can I serve? It is the supporting energy that we send and receive in return. We see the beauty of this approach to life, not in the things we attract, but in a wonderful sense of satisfaction that supersedes our self-centered and ambitious demands. We are living the meaning of life. Going back to Shakespeare again, I love this observation he makes in Henry VI, Part 3. One of my personal heroes is Mother Teresa, who spent her final years teaching and serving others. He once commented, "Love cannot stand on its own, it makes no sense. Love must be put into action, and that action is service." These words have inspired me and helped me move away from my ego's ambitions to serve myself into a life dominated by service to others. Today my life is almost 100% dedicated to service in one way or another. Each day begins with a prayer of thank you, which are the first words that come out of my mouth when I wake up. This is to keep me in a state of gratitude for all that I receive, as well as the opportunity to live my days in service to others. As the famous Sufi poet Rumi once said, if you only say one prayer a day, make it thank you. Before I start my day, I do my best to do something for someone else. As I receive a lot of emails, often I'm sending a shift book or DVD, a set of CDs or a DVD of a PBS special, something that I think will brighten the day of a complete stranger somewhere in the world. As I post the postage, I'm glad to hear that a surprise package of love in action will send a message to someone that there are people who care, and I am one of them. I often call someone who has told me that they are grieving the loss of a loved one or that they are sick in a hospital. Other times, some money in an envelope goes to one of the many people who serve in my community. If I am traveling in a hotel, I look for the maids who serve me so anonymously and surprise them with an unexpected gift of money. The things I am doing are not reported for recognition, but to provide real-life examples of how changing to meaning affects daily life. There are many ways we can give. It really doesn't matter what we do, the point is to get into the habit of replacing our attention on ourselves with attention on others. We must practice radical humility, seek out others to serve, keep ego at bay, and do so without expecting any reward. I am much more minimalist than I was when my life was dominated by the desires and demands of my ego. Now I really enjoy minimizing my accumulations. I frequently go through my closets, my library and my personal purchases of all kinds and give things away without expecting a thank you. I need very few luxuries, in fact, the less it disrupts my living environment, the better I feel. As I said before, I don't let a single day go by without dedicating myself to being in solidarity and serving others. The irony is that the more I give and the more time, energy, and money I spend serving others, the more I receive. And everything continues to be recycled, since without the attachment of ego to my things and my earnings, the more I receive and the more I can give away. Still, I persistently remind myself of this fourth cardinal virtue because the ego is stubborn and unwilling to gracefully withdraw. He pops up from time to time, urging me to think of myself first, accumulate whatever comes my way, and expect huge thanks and elaborate expressions of gratitude for being such a wonderful man. It tells me that I cannot afford to support the people I do, or do things for others that my higher self wants to do. Ego tells me, you can't afford to be so generous, Wayne. You worked hard for what you have. You don't have to give that much to the woman who cleans the bathrooms at the hotel, just $1 or $2 is enough. Walk away and think of yourself first. Over and over these ego messages. Sometimes I find myself imagining putting my ego in a box, sealing it, and even sitting on it to prevent it from resurfacing and moving away from my commitment to a meaningful life through practicing what I learned from Mother Teresa. We reiterate, love must be put into action, and that action is service. I remind myself that love is meaningless if I let it remain alone and focused on me. I remember Ram Dass, who told me that his years of putting aside his ego and serving his mother, father, and stepmother, as well as for people with AIDS and cancer, they were the most rewarding and meaningful moments of his life. He carried his father from bed to bathroom, cleaned him, and comforted him, never feeling like he was a burden. In fact, my friend said it was the best opportunity of his life. Dedicating himself to helping and being supportive allowed him to fully understand the true meaning behind Lao Tzu's admonition to live this fourth cardinal virtue. We can all get into the habit of living a life based on service without expecting rewards simply by adopting a practice of radical humility. This is one of the key components of highly evolved people. Just watch how nature operates. The ocean stays low but gains tremendous force. That is because all the rivers and streams eventually flow down and reach it. As the Tao Te Ching reminds us, the trees bow down with ripe fruit, the clouds hang with a gentle rain, and the noble leaders bow gracefully. This is the form of meaning and purpose. By practicing radical humility, we send a strong message to the ego that we intend to have meaning and purpose in our life, and we will live by these four cardinal virtues. These traits describe people who have transcended their false selves and are living meaningful lives. They don't torment themselves with questions like, what if my whole life has been wrong? They have made the switch to a higher level. Moving from ambition to meaning. There is a wonderful Turkish proverb that succinctly relates an underlying message to the shift. It says, no matter how far you have gone the wrong way, go back. It doesn't matter how long we've allowed ourselves to go down the path of our false self. We know when it is not leading us to a sense of purpose and meaning, and we can admit that we are on the wrong track. The awareness that our life is meaningless is more than enough proof that it is time to turn 180 degrees. Here are 3 of the most important things to pay attention to as we move down the path of a meaningful and purposeful life. 1. The change of the right to humility. This is a monumental change from the ego's habitual thought pattern, which says that we are entitled regardless of the impact on others or the planet. The fact is that we are not entitled to anything. However, the ego's self-importance keeps us in a persistent state of frustration. This type of mindset provokes widespread anger at the world and many of the people within it. A sense of entitlement is an irritating mindset that creates friction. He seems indifferent, conceited, and only cares about himself. The directions we give to young, spoiled, self-centered children are valuable when we get caught up in the ego's domain. Think of someone other than yourself, share your toys and treat others the way you want them to treat you, and similar advice are also good for us to follow as we begin the change. From ambition to meaning. We must put aside the childish vision that the world owes us. President John F. Kennedy's famous call to "Don't ask what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country" is a poignant reminder to collectively move away from a sense of entitlement and in the direction of humility. Here, we live from a place of God realization rather than self-centeredness. Making the switch to humility doesn't mean that we belittle ourselves or are weak, but it does mean that we think about serving others before ourselves. Humility is the path of service, nurturing the sense of purpose that gives a dimension of meaning to our lives. When we realize that we are thinking about what we have the right to do, we can remind ourselves that we are on the wrong path. Then we can find a way to get back to humility and get back on the path to the experience of meaning. When we ask ourselves, How can I want for another person even more than I feel entitled to? This can help suspend our sense of entitlement, even for a moment. Purpose flourishes through the practice of radical humility. It does not feed on thoughts about what we feel we are entitled to receive. 2. The shift from control to trust. If we are honest with ourselves, we can all agree that we are familiar with the part of the ego that controls and manages our lives and eagerly tries to do the same for others. Whether they are family, friends, co-workers, or even strangers, the ego routinely takes on the job of turning God aside and assuming the role of manipulative teacher. As we move in a different direction, we realize the futility of trying to control any individual or situation. We recognize this need to practice interference as the power trip of our false selves. There was a time in my life, for example, when I needed to be in charge of most social conversations. Having made the switch from control to trust means that I now flow with the direction of the conversation and the opinions being expressed. I am content to sit back and watch, even when others take on the role of the false me, as I see it. I can smile inwardly at some of my children's decisions in life, even when I disagree. The change from control to trust has increased my non-interference. Beyond my personal interactions with friends and family, in a much broader sense I am more confident and less in control. In my heart I know that God writes the books, makes the speeches, and builds the bridges. When trust replaces control, turning away from God is not attractive. Everything I have seen teaches me to trust the Creator, for everything I have not seen may have been Ralph Waldo Emerson's words, but I so completely agree that they could be mine. I absolutely trust the wisdom of the universe and its creative source. With confidence, we acknowledge our own wisdom. We remember that we come from the same source and therefore we must be like where we come from. We can trust source to guide us, rather than screwing things up with the ego's demands for self-recognition and belief in our superiority. Trust allows us to listen rather than take control. Listening allows us to sit comfortably, knowing that the creative source of everything is in charge rather than our petty ego. Moving from control to trust is very important to our life's work. In the movie The Shift, I relate how I found the path that resonated with the call of my soul. I did it by listening to what I was feeling deep inside, rather than what my ego was telling me about how to capitalize on my fame by writing books to earn more money. By relying on my inner enthusiasm, I was able to make a big change in my life, going from writing about psychology to writing about living life from a spiritual orientation. That departure from ego ambition, which tried to control my career as a writer and speaker, put me on the path of meaning. When you disconnect from ego control, what do you trust? There are 3 markers to look for on this trail. They are, trusting yourself, trusting others, and trusting the source of being. Here is a brief explanation of each of them. Believe in yourself. This means listening to your soul speak in whatever way it does. Intuition is generally a reliable voice, in whatever way it is expressed individually. Mahatma Gandhi explained his sense of it. What is truth? A difficult question, but I have solved it for myself by saying that it is what the inner voice tells you. Trust others. This means no interference as much as possible. Everyone has the universe located in him or her. Trusting others frees you from feeling compelled to interfere. In the words of Lao Tzu in the Tao Te Ching, do you think you can take over the universe and improve it? I don't think it can be done. Everything, and everyone, under heaven is a sacred vessel and cannot be controlled. Trying to control leads to ruin. Trying to grab, we lose. Trust in the source of being. This means trusting in the mystery of creation. The universal source of all creation, however invisible, guides you just as it guided your development in the womb. When you trust divine intelligence, you cooperate and invite the change of meaning. 3. The change of attachment when letting go. Perhaps the greatest lessons of my life have revolved around the motto of the moment of recovery, let go and let God, a notion that involves giving up ego attachment or fear of something. The most pronounced attachment for most of us during the morning of our lives is the attachment to being right. There is nothing the ego likes more than being right, which makes practicing abandonment an important and satisfying attachment. I seriously doubt that there is anyone reading this book who has not engaged in arguing about trivial matters that turned into disagreements, which had the net effect of following a path of moralistic anger. And all of that probably didn't seem to be due to any other reason than the need, the desire, to be right. Over time, we can look back wistfully, realizing now that our fear of being wrong was so strong then that someone else's opinion could energize this unwanted feeling. Ego's strategy was to be right no matter what, a highly successful maneuver that effectively distracted us from genuine purpose. Letting go of the attachment to being right is a fairly simple exercise. The choice to let go and let God, in a quest to eliminate our attachment to being right, is simplified with these few words: you are right about that. But keep in mind that kindness and sincerity are necessary here, as opposed to sarcasm or insincerity. Those 4 words will gradually open the entry point to a path that leads through letting go and letting God, to experience more meaning in life. Another way to easily practice breaking ego attachments is to clean out your garage, closets, and closets. Let go of material possessions and practice not clinging to them. If they haven't been used in the last 12 months, they belong elsewhere. We can train ourselves to be one of those that Joel Goldsmith describes in his book A Parenthesis in Eternity, Living the Mystical Life. Then there are those who reach a stage where they realize the futility of this constant effort and fight for things that perish, things that after they are obtained turn out to be shadows. It is at this stage that some people stop looking for things in the outer realm to look for them in God. Most of the stress results from holding on to beliefs that keep us striving for more, because the ego stubbornly refuses to believe that we don't need something. When we make the change, the influence of our ego fades. We replace attachment with joy. Chasing and fighting, and then sticking to what we pursue, is a source of anxiety that invigorates ambition, but will not satisfy the need for meaning at the soul level. Everything we pursue ultimately takes us away from our original nature. All of our attachments are destined to perish. They are all shadows, as Goldsmith points out. As we move in the direction of our authentic self, all the changes in this chapter on meaning become natural ways of being. New attitudes make us feel good, and we notice how the selfish demands that we allow to dominate our existence are no longer comfortable. The meaning takes precedence over the ambition of the ego. Living the 4 cardinal virtues and making the changes towards humility, trust, and letting go feels natural because we are reuniting with our original nature. A life of meaning is literally just a thought away. I close with the words of Sir Lawrence van der Post describing the story of the African Bushmen about 2 types of famine and their relationship to the meaning and purpose of our lives, which also opens the introduction to this book. For me, these paragraphs are highly symbolic on many levels. Reread them in the spirit of the shift, knowing that each of us is responsible for the meaning we find in our lives. The Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert speak of 2 famines. There is the great hunger and there is the little hunger. Little hunger wants belly food, but the great hunger, the greatest hunger of all, is the hunger for meaning. Ultimately, there is only one thing that deeply and deeply embitters human beings, and that is having imposed a meaningless life on them. There is nothing wrong in seeking happiness, but much more comfort to the soul. There is something greater than happiness or unhappiness, and that is meaning. Because meaning transfigures everything. Once what you are doing has meaning to you, it is irrelevant whether you are happy or not. You are happy, you are not alone in your spirit, it belongs to you. Sir Lawrence van der Post from Hasten Slowly, a Mickey Mullen film. End. The change that takes your life from ambition to meaning. Wayne Dyer.